10 years ago, my parents threw me onto the street with a single suitcase so they could drain my college fund to pay for my sister's country club wedding. I spent a decade building a life completely without them thanks to the one family member who actually gave a damn. So when my mother stood sobbing on my porch in the pouring rain last week, begging for my help, I was more than ready to slam the door right in her face. But the 7 words she screamed right before the lock clicked shut changed absolutely everything. My name is Chloe Bennett. I am 28 years old, and I work as a financial auditor in Seattle. I make my living looking for the truth, hidden inside balance sheets and tax returns. I track missing numbers and expose lies for a living. You could say my career choice was deeply personal. I learned very early in life that the people who are supposed to protect you are often the ones hiding the biggest debts. It was a Tuesday night. The kind of relentless driving rain that Seattle is famous for was hammering against the windows of my townhouse. I had just finished reviewing a particularly grueling quarterly report for a client. I was in my sweatpants holding a mug of decaf tea ready to turn off my brain for the night. The clock on the microwave read 9:45. Then the doorbell rang. It was a jarring, abrasive sound. I was not expecting anyone. I walked to the front door, pulling my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. I looked through the peephole. My breath caught in my throat. I actually stepped back, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Standing on my front porch, drenched by the rain and shivering in the cold, was my mother, Susan. I had not seen this woman in exactly 10 years. The last time I looked at her face, she was standing perfectly dry and perfectly furious in the foyer of our old house in Portland. But the woman on my porch right now looked nothing like the proud, domineering matriarch I remembered. Her hair was plastered to her cheeks. Her mascara was running down her face in dark streaks. She was clutching her trench coat together with shaking hands. She looked pathetic. She looked desperate. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. I kept my body firmly planted in the gap. I did not say hello. I did not ask how she was. I just stared at her, letting the cold air rush into my warm hallway. "Chloe," she gasped. Her voice broke into a loud, wet sob. "Oh, thank God you are home. Chloe, please. You have to help me. You have to let me in." She reached a hand out toward the doorframe. I shifted my weight, blocking her completely. The physical boundary was absolute. "What are you doing here, Susan?" I asked. My voice was steady. It was the exact same tone I used when a corporate client tried to feed me a fabricated expense report. Cold, professional, unmoved. She flinched at the sound of her first name. "I am your mother," she cried, wiping the rain and mascara from her eyes. "Please, it is freezing out here. It is your father. Robert is in terrible trouble. We are going to lose everything, Chloe. The bank, the creditors, they are coming after us. We need you. We need your help to sort out this financial mess. Please, you are an auditor. You know how to fix this." I looked at the woman crying on my porch and felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No warmth. Just a profound, heavy realization of how deeply she underestimated my memory. "You need my help," I repeated. The words tasted like ash. "You drove 3 hours in the middle of a storm to ask for my help with your finances." "Yes," she sobbed, taking a half step forward. "We have nowhere else to turn. Todd and Jessica are dealing with their own things. We need family right now, Chloe. Family has to stick together." The sheer audacity of the word family coming from her mouth sent a surge of adrenaline straight through my veins. "Do not talk to me about family," I said. My voice was low, but it cut right through the sound of the rain. "Do you remember where I was 10 years ago, Susan? Do you remember what you and Robert did?" She looked away. Her tears stuttered for a moment. "Chloe, please, that was a long time ago. We were under a lot of stress." I did not let her finish. "You packed my belongings into a single suitcase," I told her, making sure she heard every single word. I was 18 years old. I had just been accepted to the state university. I came downstairs and found my bags on the porch. "You stood exactly where you are standing now, but on the inside of the door." And you told me I had to leave because you and Robert needed to cash out my college savings account. She tried to interrupt. We needed that money for your sister. Jessica was marrying Todd. Todd Harrison was a wealthy lawyer, Susan. He was a catch. He was going to elevate the family status. And Jessica simply had to have a $70,000 wedding at the country club to impress his parents. You told me my education was a poor investment compared to securing Jessica's future. You told me to figure it out myself. Then you locked the door. I watched her face. The rain was still pouring down, soaking her shoulders, but I felt incredibly warm. I was no longer the terrified teenager sitting on a porch in the dark crying because the two people who were supposed to love her had decided she was entirely disposable. I was a grown woman standing in a house I paid for with my own money. Family makes sacrifices, Chloe, she argued. Her voice took on that familiar defensive edge. The same tone she used to justify every unfair thing she ever did to me. We did what we had to do for the greater good of the family. Jessica needed that wedding. It secured her place. And look at you. You turned out fine. You have a great job. You have a nice house. We clearly did not ruin your life. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest. You are right, I said. You did not ruin my life. But you do not get to claim any credit for my success. You do not get to throw me into the ocean and then congratulate yourself when I learn how to swim. I turned out fine because I worked full-time while taking double course loads. I turned out fine because I slept 4 hours a night for 4 years. And I turned out fine because of Aunt Clara. At the mention of her sister's name, Susan's jaw tightened. Even standing in the freezing rain begging for help, my mother could not hide her lifelong resentment of Aunt Clara. Clara spoiled you, Susan muttered. She always interfered where she did not belong. Clara took me in. I snapped back. When you threw me away, she drove to Portland in the middle of the night and picked me up. She spent her own retirement savings to help me pay my university tuition so I would not drown in student debt. She gave me a home. She gave me love. You gave me a suitcase and a slammed door. I looked at Susan's designer trench coat. It was soaked, but I recognized the brand. It cost more than my first car. You and Robert made your choice 10 years ago, I told her. You chose your golden child. You chose Todd's fancy law firm and the country club life. If Robert is in financial trouble now, go ask Jessica and Todd for help. Go ask the lawyer son-in-law you bought with my college fund. You are not my mother. You are just a woman who used to live in the same house as me. I took a step back into my foyer and began to push the heavy oak door closed. Chloe, wait. Susan slammed her hand flat against the wet wood. Her face twisted into genuine panic. The defensive anger vanished, replaced by wild desperation. You cannot shut the door on me. You have to listen. I am done listening, I said. Have a safe drive back to Portland. The door was 3 inches from closing. The latch was about to catch. It is not just about Robert, she screamed over the rain. It is about Clara. I stopped pushing. My arm froze. The blood drained from my face. What did you say? I asked. Susan was panting, clutching the edge of the door frame as if it were a life raft. It is Aunt Clara, she gasped. She had a stroke, Chloe. A bad one. She is in the hospital. The world around me seemed to stop spinning. The sound of the rain faded into a dull, distant roar. Aunt Clara. The woman who had been my real mother for the past decade. The woman who baked me a cake for every exam I passed, who held me when I cried from exhaustion, who was the only reason I had a life worth living. I had just spoken to her on Sunday. She had sounded perfectly fine. She had talked about planting her spring garden. Is she alive? I demanded. My voice was no longer professional. It was raw and shaking. She is alive, Susan said quickly, sensing that she finally had leverage. She is stable but incapacitated. She cannot speak. She cannot make decisions. They have her at the medical center downtown. I stared at Susan. My mind was racing. Why would the hospital call Susan Clara and Susan had not spoken in 8 years? I was Clara's emergency contact. I was the one listed on all her medical charts. Why are you here? I asked, my eyes narrowing. If Clara is in the hospital, why did you drive 3 hours to my house instead of calling me? Susan swallowed hard. She looked down at her wet shoes, then back up at me. We came up as soon as we heard. Robert and I are at a hotel near the hospital. We want to bring her home to Portland with us. We want to take care of her, Chloe. But the hospital will not let us make any medical or financial decisions because your name is on her paperwork. I stood there gripping the doorknob so hard my knuckles turned white. My parents, who despised Clara, who mocked her modest lifestyle and resented her for taking me in, suddenly wanted to move her into their home and manage her finances. The same parents who were supposedly drowning in debt and facing creditors. My analytical brain, trained to find discrepancies and follow the money, immediately began ringing alarm bells. This was not a rescue mission. This was a hostile takeover. Susan looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. We just need you to sign over the power of attorney, Chloe. Just let us handle this burden for you. Family has to stick together in a crisis. I looked at the woman standing on my porch. 10 years ago, she had locked me out. Now she was trying to use the only person I loved to force her way in. I slowly pulled the door open, stepping aside to let her into the hallway. The rain blew in behind her, chilling the hardwood floor. I was letting the wolf into my house, but I needed to know exactly what kind of trap she was trying to set. Come inside, Susan, I said quietly. Let's talk about... I stepped aside and let the cold Seattle rain blow into my foyer as my mother crossed the threshold. She brought the scent of damp wool and sheer desperation into my house. My house. The home I had purchased entirely on my own with the money I earned after she threw me away like yesterday's trash. I watched her wet shoes leave dull marks on my pristine oak hardwood floors. 10 years ago, I would have rushed to the hallway closet to get her a warm towel. I would have tripped over my own feet trying to make her comfortable. I would have done anything to earn a single scrap of her approval. But tonight, I just closed the front door and turned the lock. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place felt exactly like a judge striking a gavel. I guided her into the living room. I did not offer to take her coat. I did not offer her a seat on my cream-colored sofa, but she took one anyway. She perched on the very edge of the cushions, holding her designer handbag tightly in her lap. She looked like a bird ready to take flight the moment a sudden noise startled her. The silence between us was heavy and suffocating. It was loaded with a full decade of unspoken anger and a million unanswered questions. But I was not going to be the one to break that silence. I stood near the fireplace with my arms crossed over my chest and waited for her to speak. Susan took a deep, shaky breath. She stared down at her lap for a long moment before finally looking up. Clara had a stroke 3 days ago, she said. Her voice was trembling, but I could not tell if the emotion was genuine or carefully rehearsed. It was a severe stroke, Chloe. The doctors at the hospital say she's entirely incapacitated right now. She cannot speak. She cannot walk or feed herself. She is relying on feeding tubes and round-the-clock monitoring in the intensive care unit. The words hit me like a physical blow straight to my chest. Aunt Clara, my absolute rock. The woman who had driven 3 hours through the night to rescue an 18-year-old girl who was sitting on garbage bags in the dark. The woman who had spent her own hard-earned retirement savings to pay my university tuition so I would not drown in student loans. The woman who taught me how to budget my money, how to cook a decent meal, and how to finally believe that I was worth something. I had just spoken to her on Sunday afternoon. She had sounded perfectly fine. She had talked for 20 minutes about planting her spring garden and how she wanted me to come over on the weekend to help her pick out new tomato plants. I felt a sudden desperate urge to drop everything. I wanted to run out the front door, jump into my car, and drive straight to the downtown medical center. My vision blurred with tears of sudden panic. But I forced those tears back down. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I could not afford to break down in front of Susan. I needed to keep my mind sharp and my emotions completely locked away. I am Clara's primary emergency contact, I said. My voice was tight but controlled. The hospital has my cell phone number and my office number on file. I have been listed on her medical charts for 10 years. Why did they not call me immediately? Susan looked back down at her wet shoes. The hospital tried to reach out to the biological next of kin first, she explained smoothly. Since your father, Robert, is her biological brother, they contacted him in Portland. The hospital administration was just following their standard protocol for catastrophic medical events. I knew that was a lie. Clara had explicitly removed Robert from all her medical directives years ago. But I did not call Susan out on the lie just yet. I let her keep talking so she would reveal exactly what she wanted. She looked back up at me and her expression morphed into a mask of deep maternal concern. It was a mask I knew was completely fake. Chloe, we know how close you and Clara have become over the past decade, she said softly. We know she took care of you when things were difficult between us. Your father and I have been doing a lot of soul-searching lately. We want to make amends. We want to bring Clara home to Portland with us. We want to set up a medical bed in our living room and care for her properly. We want to hire private nurses and make sure she's comfortable. She is family after all, and family takes care of their own. I walked over and sat down in the armchair directly across from her. I folded my hands perfectly in my lap. In my career as a financial auditor, I do not just look at numbers on a spreadsheet or balances in a ledger. I look closely at the people presenting those numbers to me. I look for the glaring inconsistencies in their stories. I look for the physical tells that reveal a hidden lie. People who are lying always overcompensate. They offer way too many unprompted details. They push too hard for a quick and quiet resolution. Right now, my mother was a walking red flag. I studied her closely with an auditor's eye. Susan would not meet my gaze for more than a second at a time. Her eyes kept darting nervously to the coffee table, to the window, to the floorboards. Her hands were trembling constantly as she gripped the handle of her purse. And then I looked specifically at that purse. It was a very expensive designer handbag. It was a brand I recognized from the days when she used to parade around the country club with Jessica, showing off the lifestyle she thought she deserved. But looking closely under the bright living room lights, I saw the stark truth. The fine leather was deeply scuffed at the corners. The gold plating on the metal clasp was chipped and fading to dull gray. The expensive stitching near the handle was fraying badly. This was not the handbag of a woman living comfortably in luxury. This was the handbag of a woman desperately holding on to the fading ghost of wealth. It was the bag of a woman who was drowning in financial ruin but trying to pretend she was still on a luxury cruise. Susan reached into that frayed designer bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She set it gently on the glass coffee table between us. She slid it forward until it touched the edge of my coaster. Since you are listed as Clara's primary contact on the medical directives, we need your signature to legally take over her care, Susan said. Her voice grew slightly faster, rushing through the explanation. Robert and I have the facilities and the time to look after her. We just need you to sign over the medical and financial power of attorney to your father. It is just a standard formality, really. It will simply allow us to handle her incoming medical bills, pay her property taxes, and arrange for her secure medical transport down to Portland. The words hung in the quiet air of my living room. Financial power of attorney. Handle her bills. Handle her assets. My protective instincts flared so hot and so fast, I could almost taste copper in my mouth. The math suddenly made perfect and terrifying sense. Robert and Susan hated Aunt Clara. They had not spoken a single kind word to her in over a decade. They deeply resented her for taking me in and providing for me when they refused. They mocked her modest lifestyle and called her a foolish old woman who did not know how to build real wealth. My parents were incredibly selfish people who only cared about country club memberships and luxury cars. They would never voluntarily take on the grueling, exhausting 24-hour physical burden of caring for an incapacitated stroke victim. They did not want to care for Aunt Clara. They wanted Aunt Clara's money. They wanted total legal control of her bank accounts, her retirement funds, and her fully paid-off house in Seattle. Susan had just admitted on my front porch that they were facing severe financial trouble. They were being chased by creditors. They needed a massive influx of cash to save themselves from bankruptcy, and they saw my incapacitated, helpless aunt as an unlocked bank vault, just waiting to be emptied. If I signed that piece of paper on the coffee table, I would be handing them the legal right to drain every single penny Clara had worked her entire life to save. They would sell her house out from under her, dump her in the cheapest state-run facility they could find, and use her life savings to pay off their own debts. I felt a cold surge of absolute fury. The woman who had thrown me out onto the street was now trying to use me to rob the woman who had saved my life. I knew that if I said no right now, Susan would immediately warn Robert. They would hire expensive lawyers using whatever credit they had left. They would use my brother-in-law, Todd, and his aggressive legal tactics to tie me up in family court. They would claim I was an estranged, greedy niece trying to hoard Clara's money for myself. I had to outsmart them. I could not fight a desperate family and a corrupt lawyer in a straight brawl tonight. I had to buy myself enough time to build a fortress around Clara's life. I leaned forward and put my face in my hands. I forced my shoulders to shake. I let a loud, ragged sob escape my throat. I played the role of the overwhelmed, devastated, heartbroken niece perfectly. "Oh my God," I cried, wiping imaginary tears from my face. "I cannot believe this is happening. She was just fine on Sunday. I cannot lose her, Susan. I just cannot process this right now." Susan leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with sudden hope. "I know it is so hard, Chloe," she cooed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "That is why you need to let your father and me handle the heavy lifting. Just sign the papers and you will not have to worry about the hospital bills or the insurance companies. We will take all that stress away from you." I shook my head wildly, keeping my hands over my eyes. "I cannot read legal documents tonight," I wept. "My brain is completely foggy. I need to go to the hospital tomorrow morning. I need to see her with my own eyes. I need 24 hours to consult with her primary doctors and understand her prognosis before I sign away her legal rights. Just give me 24 hours to wrap my head around this nightmare." Susan frowned, clearly frustrated by the delay. She reached out and tapped the manila folder. "The hospital needs these forms processed quickly, Chloe. Delays will only complicate her transfer to a better facility." I stood up abruptly, wiping my face with the sleeve of my cardigan. 24 hours, Susan," I repeated, injecting just enough stubborn grief into my voice to make it believable. "I will meet you and Robert tomorrow evening. But right now, I need you to leave my house. I need to be alone." Susan realized she was not going to get the signature tonight. She stood up smoothly, smoothing the front of her expensive coat. She left the manila folder sitting squarely on the coffee table. "Read them over tonight," she said softly. "You will see. It is the best thing for everyone. We will call you tomorrow afternoon." I followed her out to the hallway and opened the front door. The rain was still falling in sheets across the dark street. Susan walked out onto the porch, opening her umbrella. She did not look back as she walked down the driveway to her parked car. I stood in the doorway and watched her taillights fade into the rainy night. The moment her car turned the corner and disappeared from sight, my tears instantly stopped. My shaking hands went completely still. The weeping, overwhelmed girl vanished, and the meticulous financial auditor returned. I slammed the front door shut and locked it. I did not walk back into the living room to read their fraudulent documents. I ran straight to the hallway table and grabbed my car keys. I grabbed my thick waterproof jacket and my heavy flashlight. I was not going to sleep tonight. I was driving straight to Aunt Clara's house to secure every single piece of her personal mail, her financial files, and her property deeds before the vultures could begin to circle. The war had just started, and I was going to make absolutely certain that my family lost everything. The drive across Seattle toward the Ballard neighborhood was a blur of flashing brake lights and relentless driving rain. The storm was pouring down in heavy sheets against my windshield, making the familiar roads look distorted and strange. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. My heart was pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. I could not shake the image of my mother standing on my front porch just 30 minutes ago with that calculated fake look of concern plastered across her face. I knew my mother better than anyone. I knew the extreme lengths she would go to for money and social status. I knew she did not possess a single ounce of genuine maternal love. I turned onto Aunt Clara's quiet residential street and pulled into the narrow driveway of her modest single-story craftsman house. This house was not a sprawling mansion. It did not have imported marble columns or a grand circular driveway like the country club estates my parents constantly worshipped and desperately tried to emulate. But to me, this small house was the safest place on the entire planet. Aunt Clara had purchased this property over 30 years ago. She had worked 40-hour weeks as a dedicated public school administrator, saving every single spare dollar she earned to pay off the mortgage early. She valued her financial security and her independence above absolutely everything else. When my biological parents threw me out onto the street 10 years ago, simply because they wanted to steal my college fund, this was the house that took me in. Clara had given me the guest bedroom with the cheerful yellow wallpaper, and she promised me I would never have to worry about being homeless again. She spent her own retirement savings to put me through university. Now the front windows of her beautiful home were completely dark. The silence of the empty house felt heavy and deeply wrong. Clara belonged inside baking in her warm kitchen or reading in her favorite floral armchair by the fireplace. Instead, she was lying in a cold, sterile hospital bed, hooked up to loud monitoring machines. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside quickly, shaking off the cold rain. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old paperback books. It smelled like safety and unconditional love. But tonight, I did not feel safe at all. I felt like a criminal trespassing in my own sanctuary. I turned on the hallway light and walked straight down the corridor to the small den Clara used as her home office. As a professional financial auditor, I make my living looking for the dark things people try to hide. I know that the truth is always buried somewhere in the paperwork. People can lie with their tears and their dramatic words, but the physical documents always tell the real and apologetic story. Clara was an incredibly organized woman. She kept her utility bills in a blue binder, her medical records in a green folder, and her bank statements neatly filed in a locked solid oak desk. I knew exactly where she kept the spare brass key. It was taped underneath the bottom right drawer. I knelt down, retrieved the hidden key, and unlocked the desk. The old metal hinges gave a soft groan as I pulled the main drawer open. I started pulling out folders and scanning the labels, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I was not entirely sure what I was searching for at first. I just knew my parents wanted total legal control of Clara's life, and they wanted it urgently. My mother had been far too desperate on my porch. You do not demand a financial power of attorney at 10 o'clock at night in a rainstorm unless a very strict deadline is closing in on you. I sifted through Clara's recent mail, which was stacked neatly on top of the desk blotter. Most of it was harmless junk mail, charity donation requests, and standard utility bills. But then I noticed a thick manila envelope shoved awkwardly to the very back of the bottom drawer. It was not labeled in Clara's neat handwriting. It looked like it had been hastily hidden by someone who was rushing. I pulled the heavy envelope out and opened the metal clasp. My hands were trembling as I slid out a thick stack of dense legal documents printed on high-quality bond paper. The corporate logo at the top of the first page belonged to a massive national banking institution. I read the title of the document and my blood instantly ran ice cold. It was an application and conditional approval packet for a massive reverse mortgage on Aunt Clara's house. I sat down heavily in Clara's desk chair, feeling all the air violently leave my lungs. A reverse mortgage is a specific financial product that allows elderly homeowners to convert their hard-earned home equity into immediate liquid cash. It is essentially a high-interest loan secured against the total value of the house. For a woman like Clara, who absolutely despised debt and had spent decades fiercely protecting her financial independence, taking out a reverse mortgage made zero logical sense. She lived comfortably, but well below her means. She had a solid state pension and excellent health insurance coverage. She did not need a sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. I leaned forward over the desk, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal paragraphs of the banking contract. The requested loan amount was for nearly the entire appraised value of the house, Whoever took out this predatory loan was trying to drain every single drop of equity Clara had built over her entire lifetime. I flipped frantically to the final page of the contract where the authorization signatures were required. My breath caught sharply in my throat. There at the bottom of the page on the dotted line was the name Clara Bennett. But it was absolutely not Clara's signature. Clara had beautiful, elegant, cursive handwriting. She had learned traditional penmanship in a Catholic school in the 1960s, and her signature was always fluid and completely flawless. The signature on this legal banking document was jagged and forced. The letters were cramped tightly together. The looping curve on the letter C was completely wrong and unsteady. It looked exactly like someone had tried to trace her signature from an old document, but their hand had slipped under the pressure. It was a sloppy, desperate, and entirely fraudulent forgery. I stared at the forged blue ink, feeling a massive tidal wave of physical revulsion wash over me. Someone was trying to steal Clara's house right out from under her. I turned back to the first page to carefully examine the loan origination details. The primary lender was a national bank, but the loan processing was being brokered and pushed through a local independent title company to expedite the funding. I read the name of the title company printed in small font at the bottom of the page and felt a sudden sharp click in my brain. It was a boutique real estate firm based in downtown Portland. I knew that exact corporate name. I had personally audited a complex commercial real estate deal 3 years ago that involved this specific title company. They were directly partnered with a very specific corporate law firm. I pulled out my cell phone and did a quick search through public business registries just to verify my memory. The search results confirmed my absolute worst fear. The title company was practically a subsidiary of Harrison & Associates. That was Todd Harrison's law firm. Todd was my sister Jessica's husband. He was the arrogant, wealthy lawyer my parents had traded my college fund to impress. The entire sickening criminal conspiracy suddenly snapped into crystal clear focus. The pieces of the puzzle fit together with terrifying precision. My parents did not want to bring Clara home to Portland to care for her. They utterly despised her. They were actively trying to steal her primary financial asset while she lay helpless and incapacitated in a hospital intensive care unit. Robert and Susan had forged Clara's signature on the reverse mortgage application. They were using Todd's high-level legal connections and his partnered title company to fast-track the approval process and bypass the standard banking fraud checks. They were literally days away from receiving a massive lump sum payout that would completely empty the equity from Clara's home, leaving her with nothing. But then Clara suffered the sudden stroke. The severe medical emergency threw a massive roadblock into their criminal machinery. The bank likely required a final verbal verification, or Clara's physical presence with a notary, to finalize the massive wire transfer. With Clara intubated, unable to speak, and unable to sign any final closing documents, their illegal payday was completely frozen. That was exactly why Susan had shown up on my porch sobbing in the pouring rain. That was why they needed the medical and financial power of attorney so urgently tonight. If my father Robert possessed that legally binding document, he could confidently walk into the bank and sign the final closing papers on Clara's behalf. He could authorize the massive wire transfer directly into his own personal bank account, legally bypassing all the automated fraud alerts. They were trying to use me to hand them the legal keys to Clara's total destruction. If I had blindly signed that paper to ease my mother's fake dramatic tears, I would have been legally handing them the weapon to leave Clara completely homeless and destitute. I felt a level of pure burning disgust so profound, it physically ached in my bones. My own parents were not just toxic, manipulative narcissists. They were actively engaging in federal bank fraud, identity theft, and severe elder abuse. They were entirely willing to leave a sick elderly woman penniless, just to line their own pockets and maintain their fake lifestyle. I stood up from the desk and began to pace across the small room. My mind was racing, analyzing the risk, the exposure, and the undeniable evidence sitting on the desk. The sheer audacity of the crime was staggering. Robert and Susan were certainly desperate and foolish enough to try something this reckless, but Todd was different. Todd was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown law firm. He was supposed to be a brilliant, cautious legal mind. He made mid-six figures a year. He drove a customized luxury sport utility vehicle and lived in an exclusive gated community. Why would a wealthy, successful attorney risk his entire career, his pristine law license and years in federal prison, to help his broken laws steal a middle-class house in Seattle? It did not make any logical sense. Wealthy, comfortable people do not commit sloppy, traceable mortgage fraud unless they are incredibly desperate. Todd had to be hiding something massive behind his perfect smile. The extravagant country club lifestyle, the expensive tailored suits, the flawless family image they broadcasted on social media had to be a complete illusion. If Todd was genuinely willing to risk federal prison to get his hands on Clara's home equity, he was clearly drowning in deep financial waters. I needed to know exactly how deep that water was. I needed to know what kind of desperate monster I was actually dealing with before I planned my counterattack. I walked back to Clara's desk and pulled my heavy silver laptop out of my work bag. I plugged the power cord into the wall outlet and connected the computer to my encrypted mobile hotspot. As a senior financial auditor, I had legal access to high-level commercial databases, advanced forensic accounting tools, and deeply buried public records that regular people did not even know existed. I cracked my knuckles and opened my secure auditing software program. The bright screen illuminated the dark room. My parents thought I was still the helpless, vulnerable teenager they had thrown out into the cold rain 10 years ago. They thought I would crumble at the sight of my mother's weaponized tears. They had absolutely no idea that they had just picked a fight with a woman who meticulously dismantled corrupt corporate fraud networks for a living. I typed Todd Harrison's full legal name and his corporate tax identification number into the global database search bar. I hit the enter key and watched the loading screen spin in the quiet darkness of Aunt Clara's house. I was going to rip their perfect fake lives apart piece by piece, and I was going to find every single dirty secret they had ever buried. I sat in the dim light of Aunt Clara's home office. The blue glow of my laptop screen cast long shadows against the walls. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, rigid and perfectly still. I had just uncovered the forged reverse mortgage application hidden in Clara's desk. I knew my parents were trying to steal her home. I knew they were planning to use my signature to authorize the theft while Clara lay unconscious in a hospital bed. But the missing puzzle piece was my brother-in-law. Todd Harrison was a senior partner at a prestigious downtown Portland law firm. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits that cost more than my first car. He drove a customized luxury vehicle and wore a watch that could pay for a year of college tuition. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on because he represented the elite social status they had always desperately craved. Wealthy corporate lawyers do not risk losing their license to steal a modest middle-class home from an elderly woman unless they are absolutely desperate. I needed to see his real balance sheet. I needed to see the numbers he kept hidden from his country club friends. I logged into my secure auditing database. This is a specialized corporate system that aggregates public property records, civil court dockets, and credit histories. It is the exact tool I use to strip away the lies my corporate clients try to tell me during fraud investigations. I started with simple property tax records for Todd and Jessica's sprawling estate in the Portland suburbs. The search results loaded on my screen. The illusion of my sister's perfect American dream instantly shattered into a million pieces. On social media, Jessica posted weekly photos of her flawless life. She posted pictures of catered garden parties, expensive ski trips to Aspen, and her children wearing designer clothing that they would outgrow in 2 months. My mother constantly shared those photos, bragging to her church friends about her wealthy, successful daughter. But the public financial records told a completely different story. Their 5-bedroom mansion was quite literally drowning in debt. Todd had taken out 3 separate mortgages on the property over the last 4 years. The house was leveraged to the absolute maximum legal limit. They had 0 equity left. If housing prices dropped even a fraction of a percent, they would be massively underwater. I dug deeper, accessing the public civil court dockets for their county. I found a mountain of active collection notices and preliminary legal filings. The 2 luxury sport utility vehicles sitting in their pristine driveway were severely delinquent. The leasing company had already filed preliminary paperwork for repossession. I kept scrolling, my eyes scanning line after line of complete financial ruin. I found a civil judgment filed just last month by the elite country club where my parents had forced me to sacrifice my own college fund so Jessica could have her dream wedding. The club had officially suspended Jessica and Todd's membership for thousands of dollars in unpaid dues. They were living entirely on toxic credit. They were desperately shuffling money from one high-interest account to another just to keep up appearances. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. My parents had thrown me out onto the street to invest in a golden child who had built a life out of paper and lies. But maxed-out credit cards and unpaid country club dues still did not explain the sheer criminal desperation of forging a reverse mortgage on a dying woman's house. People go bankrupt every day. They downsize their homes. They trade in their luxury cars for something practical. They face the humiliation of their peers. They do not suddenly turn to federal bank fraud. There had to be a much larger fire burning behind the walls of Todd's perfect life. I leaned back in Clara's squeaky wooden desk chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought about the title company that was processing the fraudulent reverse mortgage loan. The documents showed it was directly affiliated with Todd's law firm. That meant Todd was mixing his personal financial crisis with his professional legal practice. That is the brightest red flag in the financial auditing world. I pulled out my cell phone and looked at the clock. It was past midnight, but I knew people who worked late. Over my career, I had built a very strong network of financial investigators, forensic accountants, and legal compliance officers throughout the Pacific Northwest. I sent a secure text message to a trusted colleague who specialized in legal malpractice audits down in Portland. I asked if there was any quiet industry chatter regarding Todd Harrison or his specific law firm. My phone buzzed 20 long minutes later. The reply was brief, but absolutely devastating. The message simply said that Todd's firm had quietly initiated an emergency internal audit of their client escrow accounts 3 days ago. The final puzzle piece snapped into place with sickening clarity. In the legal profession, an emergency internal audit of client escrow accounts only happens for one reason: missing funds. An escrow account is where lawyers hold money that belongs to their clients, such as settlement payouts or real estate deposits. Touching that money for personal use is the ultimate unforgivable sin in the legal world. It guarantees disbarment and almost always leads to severe criminal charges. Todd was not just broke. He was a thief. He had been embezzling money from his own legal clients to fund Jessica's absurdly lavish lifestyle and keep the collection agencies away from his front door. Now the senior partners at his firm had noticed the discrepancies. They were doing a quiet internal review to verify the missing funds before bringing in the federal authorities. Todd was standing on a trapdoor and the lever was about to be pulled. He needed a massive, untraceable influx of liquid cash immediately. He needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to replace the stolen escrow funds before the internal audit concluded and the police were called. That was the real reason my parents were trying to steal Aunt Clara's house. They were not just being greedy. They were trying to save their golden child from total public humiliation and keep their wealthy son-in-law out of a federal penitentiary. They were entirely willing to sacrifice a helpless, frugal retired schoolteacher to do it. They were going to let Clara lose the only valuable asset she had ever owned just so Jessica could keep her fake socialite status and Todd could avoid wearing a prison uniform. The sheer sociopathy of their plan made my stomach turn physically sour. They were monsters. I was no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over an inheritance or a petty disagreement about medical care. I was dealing with a cornered, desperate criminal who knew his entire life was about to collapse. A man facing federal prison will do absolutely anything to survive. I realized I could not stay in Clara's house. Her home network was not secure enough, and her simple desktop printer could not handle the hundreds of pages of evidence I needed to rapidly compile. If Todd suspected I knew the truth, He might try to destroy the digital records. I needed the commercial-grade encrypted servers at my own office in downtown Seattle. I packed Clara's forged loan documents into my leather briefcase. I locked her house tightly, making sure every deadbolt was secure, and ran through the freezing rain to my car. The drive into downtown Seattle was a blur of flashing traffic lights and rain-slicked pavement. My mind was moving 100 miles an hour, calculating every possible legal angle, every piece of evidence I needed to lock down to protect my aunt. The massive commercial skyscraper was completely empty when I swiped my security badge at the lobby turnstile. The night watchman gave me a familiar nod and waved me through. I rode the elevator up to the 22nd floor. The corporate suite of Myers Property Holdings was dark and silent. The only sound was the low hum of the centralized heating system. I walked directly into my corner office, turned on the heavy brass desk lamp, and immediately connected my laptop to the secure corporate network. I began downloading every single property record, every collection notice, every civil court judgment, and every piece of digital proof that mapped out Todd's absolute financial destruction. I formatted the data into a comprehensive audit report. I sent the massive file to the heavy-duty commercial printer down the hall. The large machine whirred to life, pulling paper from the trays and spitting out page after page of undeniable, damning evidence. I stood by the printer, watching the neat stacks of paper grow higher and higher. This was my ammunition. This was the impenetrable fortress I was going to build around Aunt Clara. I was going to use this paper trail to bury my parents and my brother-in-law so deep they would never see the sun again. I gathered the heavy, warm stacks of paper and walked back to my office. I sat down at my large mahogany desk, deeply focused on organizing the files into chronological order. I needed the narrative of his fraud to be perfectly clear for the authorities. I was so intensely focused on highlighting the discrepancies in his mortgage applications that I did not hear the elevator chime down the long hallway. I did not hear the heavy footsteps walking across the plush corporate carpet. I thought I was completely alone on the 22nd floor at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then the heavy glass doors to my private office suite slid open with a sharp, sudden metallic hiss. I froze completely. My hands stopped moving, resting flat on top of the freshly printed documents detailing his crimes. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly cold. I looked up slowly from my desk. Standing right there in the doorway of my private office, completely uninvited, was Todd. His expensive wool coat was dripping wet from the Seattle rain, leaving small puddles on the carpet. His normally charismatic, arrogant courtroom smile was entirely gone. His face was pale and drawn, contorted into a terrifying mask of cold, desperate fury. He stared at the documents spread across my desk, and then his dark, furious eyes slowly met mine. The heavy glass door to my private office suite clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Todd stood there, blocking the only exit. The rainwater dripped from his expensive wool coat onto the pristine carpet of my office, but he did not seem to notice. I had always known him as the charismatic, smooth-talking lawyer who charmed his way through family dinners and country club galas. He was the man who always had a bright white smile and a perfectly timed joke. But there was absolutely no smile on his face tonight. The mask was completely gone. His features were hardened into a mask of pure cold fury. His dark eyes were fixed squarely on me, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was looking at a truly dangerous man. He slowly reached behind him without breaking eye contact and turned the silver deadbolt on the glass door. The sharp mechanical click signaled that I was trapped. We were completely alone on the 22nd floor of a dark commercial skyscraper at 2 in the morning. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I instinctively moved my hands over the freshly printed documents on my desk, trying to cover the glaring evidence of his massive financial fraud. It was a useless reflex. He already knew exactly what I was doing. Todd walked slowly toward my large mahogany desk. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate. He stopped right in front of me, leaning his hands on the polished wood and looming over my space. The smell of damp wool and stale scotch radiated off him. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Chloe," he said. His voice was low and quiet, but it carried a terrifying edge. You think because you can run a few background checks and navigate a public database that you are somehow playing in the big leagues. I forced myself to sit up completely straight. I refused to let him see my hands trembling. I know about the missing escrow funds, Todd, I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible. I know you are under internal investigation at your law firm for embezzling client money. I know you and my parents forged Aunt Clara's signature on a reverse mortgage application to steal her house and cover your tracks. You are facing federal wire fraud charges and decades in a penitentiary. Todd did not flinch. He did not deny a single word. Instead, he let out a dry, humorless laugh that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He reached out and casually flipped over the top page of the audit report I had just printed. "You are a glorified bean counter," he sneered, looking down at me with absolute disgust. "You sit in a cubicle and play with numbers all day. You have no idea how the real world actually operates. You think a stack of printed papers is going to save you. You think you can walk into a police station and take down a senior partner at one of the most powerful law firms in Portland. You committed multiple federal crimes," I fired back, pushing my chair back slightly to put more distance between us. "The evidence is undeniable. The forged signatures, the tied title company, the delinquent mortgages. It is all right here. You are desperate, and you are going to prison." Todd slammed his fist down hard on the desk, causing my coffee mug to rattle loudly. I jumped in my seat, unable to hide my shock. He leaned his face down until he was only inches away from me. "I am a respected attorney," he hissed, his eyes wide and manic. "I golf with the superior court judges in this district. I have dinner with the local district attorneys. I know the legal system inside and out because I help run it. You are nothing, Chloe. You are an unwanted, estranged child who got thrown out on the street like garbage by her own mother and father. Who do you think a judge is going to believe? A prestigious corporate lawyer protecting his grieving family, or a bitter, alienated daughter trying to hoard an old woman's money? He was using my deepest childhood trauma as a weapon against me. He was deliberately twisting the knife, trying to break my confidence. I gripped the armrests of my chair, focusing on my breathing. "You cannot just erase the paper trail, Todd," I said, fighting to keep my voice from shaking. "The financial records speak for themselves. You cannot talk your way out of missing escrow funds." Todd stood up straight again, adjusting the cuffs of his wet coat. His manic anger shifted back into that terrifying courtroom calm. "I do not have to talk my way out of it," he said smoothly, "because you are going to sign the medical and financial power of attorney over to your father first thing tomorrow morning. You are going to sign the paperwork, and you are going to quietly step aside. I will never let you near Aunt Clara," I told him fiercely. "I am her legal emergency contact. She trusts me. I will fight you in every court in this state before I let you and my parents steal her home." Todd smiled then. It was an incredibly cruel, ugly smile. "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say," he whispered. "Because if you do not sign those papers by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'm going to file an emergency ex parte injunction in King County Family Court." I stared at him, my mind racing to process his legal jargon. An ex parte order meant he could go before a judge without me even being present in the room. "I am going to file a petition for a hostile conservatorship," Todd continued, pacing slowly back and forth in front of my desk. "I will represent your father, Robert. I will paint a very clear, very convincing picture for the judge. I will explain that Robert is Clara's loving biological brother who is desperate to care for his dying sister. And I will explain that Clara's estranged niece, a woman who was disowned by her own family for severe behavioral issues, has isolated Clara and is currently committing fiduciary negligence to hoard her assets." "That is a complete lie," I shouted, standing up from my chair. "Clara explicitly removed Robert from her life. She hates him. The courts will look at the history." Todd laughed again, shaking his head like he was dealing with a slow child. "The courts care about statutory priority, Chloe. Biological siblings hold immense weight in guardianship disputes. I will bury you in emergency motions. I will demand full forensic audits of every single cup of coffee you ever bought using Clara's money. I will tie this up in litigation for so long you will go bankrupt just paying your legal defense fees. And while we are fighting in court, I will secure a temporary guardianship order for Robert." He stopped pacing and leaned over the desk again, pointing a finger directly at my face. "And do you know what Robert is going to do the second that temporary order is signed?" I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. I could not speak. I could only shake my head. "He is going to move Clara Todd," said his voice, dropping to a dark, venomous whisper. "We are not bringing her to a nice, comfortable home in Portland. That was just a story to keep you quiet. Robert is going to use his legal authority to transfer her out of that nice downtown medical center. We are going to put her in a state-run nursing facility." The color drained completely from my face. I knew exactly what kind of places he was talking about. "I know a specific facility just outside the city limits." Todd continued, clearly enjoying the pure horror registering in my eyes. "It is severely underfunded. The floors smell like bleach and urine. The nurses are so overworked they do not check on the patients for hours at a time. The rooms are dark and the beds are hard. We are going to dump her in a shared room with 3 other dying patients. She will spend the last few months of her life staring at a peeling ceiling, listening to strangers scream in the hallway." "You cannot do that," I choked out, my voice finally breaking. "The hospital would not allow it." "I am a lawyer, Chloe," he snapped. "I can do whatever I want with the right paperwork. Robert will be her legal guardian. He has the absolute right to choose her care facility. And the best part is we will file a restraining order against you citing emotional distress to the patient. You will be legally barred from ever stepping foot on the facility grounds. If you try to visit her, the police will arrest you for trespassing." My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. My chest felt incredibly tight. Todd was systematically dismantling my entire world and using the only person I loved as collateral damage. "She will die completely alone, Chloe," he whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the rain on his skin. "She will die in a filthy bed, completely confused, wondering why the niece she sacrificed everything for never came to visit her. She will think you abandoned her just like your parents did. And all of it will be entirely your fault because you were too stubborn to sign a simple piece of paper." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the office. The only sound was the distant hum of the building's ventilation system and the pounding of my own heart. I looked at the stacks of evidence on my desk. I had the financial records proving his crimes. I had the proof of the forged reverse mortgage. But Todd was right about one critical thing. The legal system is incredibly slow. If I took this evidence to the police, or filed a countersuit, it would take weeks or even months for the authorities to fully investigate and indict him. A complex white-collar fraud case requires massive amounts of bureaucratic processing. The wheels of justice grind terribly slow. But an emergency family court injunction filed by a well-connected lawyer could be signed by a judge in a matter of hours. Clara did not have months. She was lying in an intensive care unit right now, depending on feeding tubes and monitors to keep her alive. If Todd and Robert dragged her out of that hospital and dumped her into a neglected state-run facility, she would not survive the week. The sheer trauma and lack of specialized medical care would kill her instantly. Todd knew this. He was actively counting on it. He was holding a loaded legal gun directly to Aunt Clara's head. I felt a wave of genuine, absolute terror wash over me. For the first time since I was a teenager sitting on a dark porch in Portland, I felt completely helpless. Todd was an apex predator in the legal world, and I was just an auditor. He had the connections, the legal vocabulary, and the sheer psychopathic willingness to destroy an innocent elderly woman just to save his own country club lifestyle. If I fought him head-on right now in this office, Clara would pay the ultimate price. I looked at Todd's cold, calculating eyes. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the frightened, unwanted little girl to surrender to the powerful adult in the room. My analytical mind, the same mind that had built a $23 million commercial real estate portfolio, suddenly shifted gears. I realized I could not fight a corrupt lawyer in a straight legal battle. If I challenged him directly, he would use his power to crush Clara. But Todd was acting out of extreme desperation. He needed my signature to save himself from federal prison. Desperate, arrogant men are blinded by their own egos. They only see what they want to see. If I gave him exactly what he expected from me, he would drop his guard. He would believe he had won, and that would buy me the precious time I needed to build a trap he could never escape. I had to play the victim. I had to let him believe he had broken me completely. I slumped my shoulders forward, letting my posture collapse. I took a deep, trembling breath and forced my mind to vividly recall the absolute worst memory of my childhood. I thought about the night my mother locked the door. I thought about the cold rain soaking through my clothes while I sat on garbage bags. I let that old, deep trauma flood into my chest. The tears came instantly, hot and fast. They spilled over my lower lashes and rolled down my cheeks, dropping onto the collar of my silk blouse. I looked up at Todd with wide, terrified eyes. I let my hands shake visibly as I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk. I made myself look exactly like the defeated, worthless child my parents had always told me I was. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "Please do not hurt her, Todd. She is all I have. Please do not put her in a place like that." Todd stood up straight, a triumphant, victorious smile slowly spreading across his face. The cold fury vanished, replaced by absolute smug satisfaction. He loved seeing me beg. He loved the power. "That depends entirely on you, Chloe," he said, smoothing his expensive tie. "The paperwork needs to be signed tomorrow morning. No more delays. No more reading the fine print. You sign the power of attorney over to Robert and you walk away. If you do that, Clara stays in her nice, comfortable hospital bed. If you fight me, she goes to the state ward by tomorrow night. It is your choice." I looked him dead in the eye, letting the tears stream freely down my face. I swallowed hard, making a pathetic choking sound in the quiet room. "Okay," I whispered, my voice trembling with forced defeat. "Okay, you win. I will sign it." I sat alone in my office after Todd left. The heavy glass door had clicked shut, but the chill remained. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from absolute clarity. I knew what I had to do. I had to become the very thing I had spent 10 years trying to outgrow. I had to become the terrified, unwanted little girl sitting on a dark porch in Portland. For a financial auditor, catching a thief is not about kicking down doors. It is about making the thief feel so incredibly smart that they hand you the keys to their own jail cell. Arrogance is always their ultimate downfall. My father and my brother-in-law were the most arrogant men I knew. They looked at me and saw a weak, lonely woman who was desperate for her family to love her again. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. It was 3 a.m, but I knew they would be awake. Thieves plotting to steal an old woman's home do not sleep well. I stared at the contact name on my screen. Robert. Not Dad. Just Robert. I took a deep breath. I thought about Aunt Clara lying in the hospital with a feeding tube. I thought about the lavender smell of her house and the way she held my hand when I was sobbing over my college textbooks. I let the genuine terror of losing her fill my chest. I allowed the tears to completely overflow. I needed my voice to be raw. I pressed call. The phone rang twice. Robert answered. His voice was thick with sleep and irritation. "Chloe," he said sharply. "It is the middle of the night. What do you want?" I did not answer right away. I let out a loud, ragged sob directly into the receiver. I made myself hyperventilate slightly so my breath hitched. "Dad," I cried out. "Dad, please. I am so sorry." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. He had been expecting a fight. He had been expecting the cold professional auditor who had kicked his wife out of her house earlier that night. He was not expecting the broken 18-year-old girl he had thrown away. "Chloe," he said again, but his tone had completely changed. The irritation vanished. In its place was the unmistakable sound of a narcissist realizing he had the upper hand. "Calm down. What is going on? I am just so scared I wept, wiping real tears from my cheeks. I am sitting here alone in my office, and I'm just so incredibly scared for Aunt Clara. I do not know what to do. The hospital machines are beeping and she cannot even look at me. I am so overwhelmed. I could practically hear his chest puffing out with pride. He loved this. He loved being the savior. He loved that I was finally crawling back to him, admitting I could not handle my own life. "We told you this would happen," Robert said smoothly. His voice took on that patronizing tone I remembered from my childhood. "You try to take on too much, Chloe. You always have. You are not equipped to handle a major medical crisis by yourself. That is why your mother and I came to Seattle. We are your family. We are here to take this burden off your shoulders." I know I sobbed loudly. I know I was awful to Mom earlier. I was just panicking. I felt like I was losing the only family I had left. But you are right. You are my parents. I just want my family back, Dad. I want us to be a family again. "And we will be," he promised. The satisfaction in his voice made my stomach turn. "But you have to let us help you. You have to sign that power of attorney paperwork tomorrow morning so we can transfer Clara to a proper facility in Portland. Todd has everything ready to go." This was the moment, the pivot point. I took a shaky breath, letting my voice waver perfectly. "I will sign it," I whispered. "I will sign everything over to you. I promise." "Good girl," Robert said. "But there is just one problem," I added quickly, sounding frantic and apologetic. "It is my job, Dad. The auditing firm." "What does your job have to do with Clara's medical care?" he asked, his voice hardening slightly. "Because I am a licensed financial auditor," I explained, playing the role of the nervous employee terrified of losing her career. "My firm holds my professional license. Because I have been acting as Clara's legal financial executor for the past 3 years, the firm requires a strict compliance file before I can transfer those duties to anyone else. It is just standard anti-fraud policy to close out the books. If I sign over my fiduciary duty without filing a complete exit report, the firm will flag my license." "That is ridiculous," Robert snapped. "We do not have time for corporate red tape." "I know," I cried, sounding perfectly desperate. "But it will only take me 10 minutes to process. Susan mentioned you and Todd were handling a reverse mortgage to pay for Clara's medical transport and her new care facility in Portland. If you just send me the pending loan file, I can upload it to the firm's compliance portal. I just have to prove to my boss that Clara has pending financial obligations that justify transferring the power of attorney. Once I upload that file, I can legally sign Todd's documents without losing my job." I heard muffled voices on the other end of the line. Robert had covered the receiver. He was talking to someone. Todd. They were in the same hotel room plotting their next move. I held my breath. I needed their greed to outweigh their caution. A moment later, a new voice came on the line. It was Todd. "Chloe," Todd said smoothly. His voice was dripping with that fake courtroom charm he used to manipulate judges and juries. "Your father passed the phone to me. We are all on the same team here, but I need you to understand that these mortgage documents are highly confidential. We are trying to push this through quickly to save Clara. We cannot have an auditing firm poking around our private family business." I gripped the edge of my desk. Todd was cornered. He was terrified of anyone looking at that fraudulent loan application. But he also desperately needed my signature on the power of attorney to cash out the money and save himself from prison. I had to appeal to his massive, bloated ego. "Todd, please," I whimpered. "You are a respected corporate attorney. You know exactly how strict these compliance audits are. You know I cannot bypass the Financial Regulatory Board. They will strip my CPA license. I am not asking to audit the loan. I just need the raw file to drop into the automated compliance folder. The system seals it immediately. No one even looks at it. But if the system sees that I transferred a power of attorney without a recorded financial reason, my career is completely over." I let out another pathetic sob. "Please, Todd. I am just a low-level accountant. I cannot afford to lose my job. If you just email me the pending loan file and the routing numbers for the transfer, I can clear the system flag right now. I will drive to your hotel, and sign the power of attorney at sunrise. I just want this nightmare to be over. I waited. The silence stretched for 10 excruciating seconds. I pictured Todd standing in that hotel room, weighing his options. He thought I was a terrified broken girl crying in an empty office. He thought I was an obedient little bean counter obsessed with office compliance rules. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the entire world. Fine. Todd finally sighed. He sounded incredibly annoyed, like he was doing a favor for a particularly dull child. I will send you the digital packet, but I am sending it to your personal email address, not the corporate server. You download it, you put it in your little compliance folder, and then you delete it. Do you understand me, Chloe? You delete the original email. I will, I promised quickly. I swear I will. I am hitting send right now, Todd said. We expect you at our hotel by 7 o'clock sharp with a pen in your hand. Do not test my patience again. He hung up the phone without waiting for my reply. I pulled the phone away from my ear and set it gently on the mahogany desk. I wiped the remaining tears from my face. My heart was beating with a steady, powerful rhythm. The scared little girl was gone. I turned my eyes to my computer monitor. I opened my personal email inbox. The screen was glaringly bright in the dark office. I sat perfectly still, watching the screen refresh. 1 minute passed, then 2. Then a small notification bell chimed through the quiet room. A new message had arrived in my inbox. The sender was Todd Harrison. The subject line read, "Confidential pending files." I clicked open the email. My eyes scanned the attachments. Todd was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to clear his stolen escrow accounts that he had completely abandoned basic legal caution. He had attached the entire unredacted reverse mortgage file. He had included the forged signature pages. But he had done something even more incredibly stupid. He had included the wire transfer authorization forms showing exactly where the bank was supposed to send Clara's money once the power of attorney was signed. The routing numbers did not belong to a medical transport company. They did not belong to a nursing facility in Portland. The routing numbers matched a private offshore escrow account registered directly to Todd Harrison's law firm. He had put his entire criminal conspiracy into a single digital document, and he had hit send. He thought he was dealing with a frightened child who would blindly follow orders. He did not realize he had just emailed a comprehensive map of his federal wire fraud directly to a licensed financial auditor. He had literally handed me the murder weapon with his fingerprints pressed all over the grip. I downloaded the files immediately. I saved them to an encrypted flash drive. I documented the original IP address, the timestamp, and the routing metadata. I created a digital paper trail so flawless and undeniable that no defense attorney in the country would ever be able to dispute it in court. My parents and my brother-in-law had intended to divert hundreds of thousands of dollars from a dying woman, and now I had the absolute proof locking their intent into the digital record forever. I leaned back in my leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been gripping my spine for the past 5 hours finally began to melt away. I had the weapon. I had the motive. I had the undeniable proof. But having the evidence was only half the battle. I could not simply walk into a local police precinct and hand this over to a desk sergeant. Todd was a wealthy, connected lawyer who played golf with judges. He would tie up a standard police investigation in bureaucratic red tape for months. He would use his influence to suppress the evidence and intimidate the investigators. I needed someone who knew how to bypass the local good old boys club. I needed an apex predator. I needed someone who hunted corrupt lawyers for sport. I reached for my phone again. The clock on my computer monitor read 3:45 in the morning. I scrolled through my contact list until I found the name I was looking for. Helen Vance. Helen was a ruthless former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 years destroying white-collar criminals before opening her own private practice, specializing entirely in severe elder financial abuse. She was brilliant, aggressive, and completely fearless. I pressed the call button and listened to it ring in the dark office. The trap was set, and it was finally time to call the executioner. I sat across from Helen Vance in her downtown Seattle office, just as the early morning sun began to bleed through the gray clouds. The rain from the night before was still streaking the large glass windows. I had not slept a single minute. My eyes burned and my hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline of my confrontation with Todd, but my mind was completely focused. Helen poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe on her credenza. She set one down in front of me and took her seat behind a massive oak desk. Helen was a formidable woman in her late 60s. She had silver hair cut into a sharp bob and piercing dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor putting white-collar criminals behind bars before opening her own private practice. Her entire legal career was now dedicated to hunting down people who committed elder financial abuse. She was exactly the kind of apex predator I needed. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of documents I had printed in the middle of the night. I placed them squarely on her desk. I handed her the encrypted flash drive containing the original emails from Todd. I did not waste time with small talk. I laid out the entire situation in a clear, clinical voice. I told her about the forged reverse mortgage application. I told her about Todd embezzling client funds from his law firm. I told her about my parents throwing me out 10 years ago and how they were now trying to steal Aunt Clara's fully paid-off house to save their golden child from financial ruin. Helen did not interrupt me once. She put on her reading glasses and began to sift through the paperwork. I watched her eyes move rapidly across the forged signature pages and the bank routing numbers. For a long time, the only sound in the office was the turning of pages and the distant hum of city traffic below. When Helen finally took off her glasses, her expression was utterly terrifying. It was not anger. It was the absolute cold focus of a hunter who had just caught the scent of blood. "I have seen a lot of greedy people in my long career," Helen said quietly. "I have seen children drain their parents' bank accounts. I have seen caretakers steal pension checks. But the sheer arrogance of this plan is staggering. Your brother-in-law is a practicing attorney. He knows exactly what the penalty is for federal wire fraud and elder exploitation. He is relying entirely on his social status to shield him from suspicion. He genuinely believes that because you are a young, estranged family member, no one will believe you over a respected corporate lawyer. He threatened to put Clara in a state-run nursing facility if I do not sign the power of attorney over to my father today," I told her. My voice cracked slightly at the thought of Clara lying alone in a filthy, underfunded ward. He said he would use his legal connections to block me from ever visiting her again. "I cannot let that happen, Helen. I will do whatever it takes to protect her, but I do not know how to stop a lawyer in family court." "You stop him by taking away the one thing he actually wants," Helen said, leaning forward. "Todd does not care about Clara. He does not care about her medical treatment or where she lives. He only cares about the equity in her house. He needs that massive cash payout to replace the funds he stole from his firm before they finish their internal audit. If we completely remove his access to Clara's assets, his entire hostile guardianship plan falls apart. We are going to build a legal fortress around your aunt that Todd Harrison could never breach even with an army of corporate lawyers." Helen turned to her computer and immediately began pulling up legal templates. She explained that because I was already listed as Clara's primary financial executor on her existing legal directives, we did not need to wait for a court order to protect her money. We were going to establish an irrevocable living trust. "An irrevocable living trust is the ultimate legal shield," Helen explained as her fingers flew across the keyboard. "Once Clara's assets are transferred into this trust, they no longer belong to her as an individual. They belong to the trust itself. You will be named as the sole trustee managing the assets strictly for Clara's medical benefit. Because the trust is irrevocable, it cannot be modified, altered, or dissolved by anyone. Not by me. Not by a judge. And certainly not by your father holding a shiny new power of attorney document." I felt a massive weight begin to lift off my chest. "If Robert gets the power of attorney, he still cannot touch the house," I asked, just to be absolutely certain. "He cannot touch a single dime," Helen confirmed with a sharp smile. "A power of attorney only grants control over personal assets. If the house and the bank accounts belong to the trust, Robert's document is completely useless. He could walk into that bank with all the forged papers in the world, and the bank manager would laugh in his face. The assets will be locked behind a titanium legal door, and you hold the only key. Helen worked relentlessly for the next 2 hours. She drafted the trust documents and prepared the property deed transfer. She called in a favor from a colleague at the county clerk office to ensure the deed transfer was recorded and legally binding before noon. By the time we finished Clara's house, her retirement accounts and her life savings were completely untouchable. The legal shield was fully assembled, but we still had a major problem. Todd and my parents were waiting for my signature. They expected me to show up and surrender. If I simply refused to sign the papers, Todd would realize I was fighting back. He would panic, and he might try to retaliate by interfering with Clara's hospital care out of pure spite. I needed to keep him completely blind to our trap until it was too late for him to escape. That is when Helen introduced the second part of our strategy, the decoy. Todd thinks you are a terrified little girl who does not understand the law, Helen said, her eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. We are going to use his massive ego against him. We are going to give him exactly what he asked for. We are going to give him a power of attorney document. She opened a new file on her computer. It looked exactly like a standard Washington state statutory power of attorney form. It had all the correct legal headers, the proper formatting, and the standard boilerplate language at the top of the page. To a desperate, arrogant man rushing to steal money, it would look completely authentic. But Helen was a master of legal fine print. Buried deep on page 4 inside a dense block of complex legal definitions, Helen inserted a series of highly specific voiding clauses. The clauses explicitly strip the signee of any and all rights to initiate real estate transfers, sell property, or authorize wire transfers over $500. Furthermore, she added a hidden stipulation that the document immediately became null and void if the signee was currently under investigation for financial misconduct. If Todd actually sat down and read this document word for word, he would realize it is completely worthless, Helen explained, printing the pages on heavy bond paper. But arrogant men never read the fine print when they think they have already won. He is so focused on saving himself from prison that he will grab this paper and run straight to the bank. And when he tries to use a fraudulent, voided document to process a forged reverse mortgage, we will have him dead to rights on multiple counts of federal bank fraud. I looked at the neat stack of papers resting on Helen's desk. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. It was the perfect weapon. Now I just needed to deliver it directly to the wolves. I stepped out of Helen's office and walked into the quiet hallway. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my mother's number. Susan answered on the first ring. "Chloe," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "Honey, are you okay? We have been so worried about you since you called last night." I forced myself to sound exhausted and completely defeated. "I am fine, Susan," I said quietly. "I have the compliance file submitted to my firm. My license is safe. I am ready to sign the power of attorney over to Dad so you can take Clara back to Portland." "Oh, thank goodness," Susan sighed, letting out a dramatic breath of relief. "We knew you would do the right thing, Chloe. We knew you would finally put family first. We are at the hotel downtown. You can just bring the papers to the lobby." "No," I interrupted, keeping my voice firm but weary. "I am not doing this in a hotel lobby. If I am handing over my aunt's life to you, we are going to sit down and do this properly. I booked a private dining room at the Pacific Grill for 6 o'clock tonight. It is a very quiet, upscale restaurant near the waterfront. Bring Todd and Jessica, too. I want the whole family there to witness this so there are no misunderstandings later." Susan hesitated for a moment, clearly surprised by the formal invitation. But the mention of an upscale restaurant appealed to her constant need for social status. "That sounds lovely, Chloe," she agreed smoothly. "We will see you at 6. I hung up the phone and walked back into Helen's office. The dinner was set. The trap was laid. Helen handed me the decoy folder. She also handed me a small plain white cardboard box. I opened it and looked inside. Nestled in foam packaging was a high-definition micro-audio recorder. It was no larger than a standard thumb drive. Washington is a two-party consent state for audio recordings, Helen warned me, her tone turning incredibly serious. That means recordings are generally not admissible in standard civil court unless all parties agree to be recorded. However, there is a very clear legal exception. If the recording captures active felony extortion, blackmail, or conspiracy to commit severe financial fraud against a vulnerable adult, it can be handed directly to federal investigators as evidence of an ongoing crime. You need to get Todd and Robert to admit on tape that they forged Clara's signature. You need them to admit they are diverting her money to pay off Todd's stolen escrow accounts. Let them brag. Let them feel powerful. The more they talk, the tighter they tie the noose around their own necks. I took the small white box and nodded. I will get everything we need, Helen. At 5:30 that evening, I parked my car in the dimly lit parking garage across the street from the Pacific Grill. The rain was still coming down in a steady, miserable drizzle. I sat in the driver's seat of my car with the engine turned off, listening to the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the roof. I stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked calm. I looked polished. I wore a dark tailored suit and a crisp white silk blouse, but underneath the expensive clothes my heart was pounding a relentless, heavy rhythm. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up the small white box Helen had given me. I took out the micro recorder. My fingers were slightly numb from the cold. I unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of my silk blouse and carefully secured the device to the inner lining of my jacket lapel using a strip of strong medical adhesive tape. I adjusted my collar, ensuring the tiny microphone was completely hidden from view, but perfectly positioned to capture every single word spoken at the dinner table. I pressed the small red activation button on the side of the device. A tiny green light flashed once, confirming it was recording. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, damp air of the parking garage. I thought about Aunt Clara lying in the hospital. I thought about the 10 years of peace and unconditional love she had given me. And then I thought about the greedy, arrogant people waiting for me inside that restaurant. They thought they were about to steal millions of dollars and walk away without a single consequence. They thought I was just a weak little girl who was desperate for their love. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the child they threw away. I stepped out of my car, locked the doors, and walked out into the Seattle rain. I did not carry an umbrella. I walked straight across the wet pavement, holding the decoy folder tightly against my chest. I pulled open the heavy brass doors of the Pacific Grill and stepped into the warm, glowing light of the restaurant lobby. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile and led me toward the private dining room at the back of the establishment. I could hear their voices before I even reached the door. I heard Jessica's loud, pretentious laugh. I heard Todd talking loudly about a recent golf game. I heard Susan ordering an expensive bottle of wine on my tab. They were celebrating. They were celebrating the destruction of a dying woman's life. I stood outside the heavy wooden door of the private room for 3 seconds. I squared my shoulders. I smoothed my jacket over the hidden microphone. I let my face fall into an expression of nervous, defeated surrender. I reached out, turned the brass handle, and walked right into the den of wolves. The private dining room at the Pacific Grill smelled of expensive roasted garlic, red wine, and deeply buried lies. I stood in the doorway for a fraction of a second, just watching them before they noticed I had arrived. My family was sitting around a heavy mahogany table draped in a crisp white linen cloth. They looked like a picture-perfect advertisement for the wealthy American dream. But knowing what I knew now, looking at them, made my stomach physically churn. I reached up and casually adjusted the collar of my silk blouse, making absolutely certain the high-definition micro-recorder was secure against my skin. The tiny device was hidden completely out of sight, but it felt as heavy as a brick against my chest. I took a deep breath and let the terrified, weak version of Chloe take total control of my face. I walked into the room, letting the heavy oak door click shut behind me. Jessica was the first to look up. My older sister was holding a crystal martini glass adorned with 3 olives. She wore a bright crimson designer dress and a thick tennis bracelet that caught the dim restaurant lighting. 10 years ago, I would have been intimidated by her effortless glamour. Tonight, I just looked at that bracelet and knew it was completely fake. I knew her luxury car was 3 months behind on payments, and I knew her exclusive country club had locked her out for unpaid dues. She was drowning in toxic debt, but she still managed to look down her nose at me. "Look who finally decided to join the real adults," Jessica said, swirling the clear liquid in her glass. Her voice was loud and entirely too cheerful. Susan immediately reached out and swatted Jessica on the arm lightly, playing the role of the peacemaker. "Now, Jessica, be nice to your sister," my mother scolded gently. "Chloe has had a very long and stressful day. Come here, sweetheart. Come sit right next to me." I walked over and took the empty leather chair between my mother and my father. Robert barely looked at me. He was too busy swirling a large glass of expensive amber scotch. He took a long sip and stared at the decoy folder I was clutching tightly against my chest. Todd was sitting directly across from me. He looked exhausted. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed the immense panic he was trying to hide. He desperately needed the money he had embezzled from his law firm clients replaced before his partners discovered the truth. He needed me to hand over Aunt Clara so he could save his own skin. I set the folder down on the table right next to the breadbasket. My hands were trembling perfectly. "I am so sorry I am late," I whispered, keeping my eyes focused on the white tablecloth. The traffic from the hospital was terrible. I just came from seeing Clara. She looked so frail. I do not want to lose her. My mother reached over and placed her warm, perfectly manicured hand on top of mine. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to violently pull my hand away. I forced myself to sit perfectly still and let her touch me. "We know how hard this is for you, Chloe," Susan said, her voice dripping with artificial maternal warmth. "But you are doing the absolute right thing. Clara needs proper full-time care, and your father and I have the resources to provide it. You have carried this heavy burden for entirely too long. It is time for you to let your family step up and take care of you for a change." I looked up at her, letting my eyes fill with fresh tears. "Do you really mean that, Mom?" I asked, my voice cracking on the final word. "Of course we do," Robert said, finally setting his scotch glass down on the table. He leaned in closer, giving me a rare fatherly smile. "We have all made mistakes in the past, Chloe. We let silly arguments tear us apart. But family is family. Blood is blood. Once we get Clara settled into a nice, comfortable facility down in Portland and get her medical bills paid off, we want to put all this ugly history behind us." Susan squeezed my hand tighter. "We were just talking about the holidays," she added smoothly. "We want you to come down to Portland this year. You can finally come home for Thanksgiving, Chloe. We can have a real family dinner together, just like the old days." The promise of Thanksgiving dinner hung in the air between us. 10 years ago, my mother had explicitly told me not to come home for Thanksgiving because I was a nuisance and a burden. I had spent that holiday sitting alone in a cheap diner eating a cold turkey sandwich while my family celebrated without me. Now they were dangling that exact same holiday in front of my face, using my deepest childhood trauma as a manipulation tactic. They thought I was still that desperate, lonely teenager begging for a seat at their table. They had no idea they were talking to the woman who was currently planning their absolute destruction. I swallowed hard, forcing a genuine-looking smile through my tears. "I would really love that," I whispered. "I just want us to be a family again." Perfect Todd interrupted loudly, unable to hide his extreme impatience. His hands were resting flat on the table, and he was staring intently at the folder I had brought. "Now that we have the emotional family reunion out of the way, let us handle the business at hand. Do you have the power of attorney documents, Chloe?" I slowly pulled my hand away from my mother and placed both hands on the folder. "I have them," I said nervously. "But Todd, I am just so incredibly scared about the legal side of all this. My auditing firm is so strict about financial compliance. I printed the reverse mortgage files you emailed me so I could upload them to my corporate portal, but the numbers are just so massive. It is almost the entire value of Clara's house. I leaned forward, making sure my hidden microphone was pointed directly at the center of the table. I looked right at my father. "Dad, are you absolutely sure this reverse mortgage is legal?" I asked, my voice high and anxious. "The bank application requires Clara to sign it in front of a notary. Did Clara really sign this massive loan application before she had her stroke?" Robert let out a loud, annoyed sigh. He picked up his scotch glass again and took another large swallow. He was so arrogant and so completely dismissive of my intelligence that he did not even hesitate to answer. "Of course she did not sign it," Chloe. Robert scoffed, rolling his eyes. Clara was way too sick and confused to understand complex banking documents even before her stroke. She would never agree to liquidate her house anyway. The woman is obsessed with hoarding her pennies. I signed the application for her. "It is fine." "You forged her signature," I gasped, pretending to be completely horrified. "Dad, that is bank fraud." "It is not fraud, if it is for her own good," Robert snapped back, his voice rising with defensive anger. "I am her biological brother. I am protecting her assets from being drained by greedy hospital billing departments. She is never going to wake up and live in that house again anyway. She does not need the house, Chloe. We need the cash to pay for her long-term care facility in Portland." I just traced her name on the dotted line. Nobody at the bank is going to care as long as the paperwork looks clean. I felt a massive surge of adrenaline rush through my veins. I had it. I had the biological brother explicitly admitting to federal forgery and bank fraud on a crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording. But I needed Todd to incriminate himself too. I needed the corrupt lawyer to admit his role in the conspiracy. But what about the bank appraisal? I pushed, turning my anxious gaze toward Todd. A bank will not just wire hundreds of thousands of dollars without sending an official appraiser to the house. If they send someone to Clara's house and see she is not there, the whole loan will be flagged for fraud. Todd, if my auditing firm gets tied to a flagged federal loan, I will lose my CPA license. I will go to jail. Todd let out a harsh, cruel laugh. He leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at me like I was the most pathetic, naive creature he had ever encountered. "You really do not understand how the adult world works, do you?" Chloe, Todd sneered. "You sit in your little cubicle checking spreadsheets, and you think the rules apply to everyone. I am a senior partner at a major law firm. I do not wait in line for bank appraisers. The title company processing this reverse mortgage is owned by one of my oldest fraternity brothers. I already made a quiet phone call." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The hidden microphone was capturing every single syllable. "I am fast-tracking the entire appraisal process." Todd bragged, a smug, confident smile spreading across his face. "We are completely bypassing the standard bank checks. My guy at the title company is pushing the approval through the automated system tonight. The second you sign that power of attorney over to Robert, we can legally close the loan and wire the cash directly into my firm's private escrow account." "Why your firm's escrow account?" I asked, pressing the trap perfectly. "Why not Clara's bank account?" "Because Clara's accounts will be frozen if she dies," Todd explained smoothly, his arrogance completely blinding him to the danger. "If we put the cash in my legal escrow account, it is protected by attorney-client privilege. It gives my firm room to breathe. It gives us the liquid capital we desperately need to handle some internal business without the banking regulators looking over our shoulders." I had everything. Robert had admitted to forging the signature. Todd had admitted to conspiring with a corrupt title company to bypass federal banking regulations and divert the funds into his own private account to cover his embezzlement tracks. They had handed me the absolute perfect murder weapon, and they were proudly smiling while they did it. I let out a long, trembling breath, acting like a terrified girl who was finally surrendering to the powerful men in the room. "Okay," I whispered, staring down at the table. "If you are absolutely sure this is legal, Todd." "If you are sure I will not get in trouble. You have my word as an attorney." Todd promised, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have nothing to worry about, Chloe. Just sign the damn papers so we can get this over with and order dinner." I am starving. I unclasped the heavy manila folder and pulled out the decoy power of attorney document Helen had drafted. I placed it gently on the white linen tablecloth. I pulled a blue ink pen from my purse. My hand hovered over the signature line for 3 seconds, playing the hesitation flawlessly. Then I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. Before the ink was even completely dry, Todd reached across the table and violently snatched the document out from under my hand. He practically ripped the paper, grabbing it with the desperate, frantic energy of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver. He did not read the first paragraph. He did not read the second paragraph. He completely ignored the dense block of legal text on page 4 where Helen had meticulously buried the voiding clauses. He just stared at my signature at the bottom of the page and let out a massive, heavy sigh of pure relief. The color slowly returned to his pale face. He folded the document carefully and slipped it into the breast pocket of his expensive tailored suit jacket. He patted the pocket once, securing his prize. "Well done, Chloe," Robert said, leaning back and picking up his scotch glass. "You finally made a smart decision. You see how easy things are when you stop fighting us and just listen to reason." Susan signaled the waiter with a frantic wave of her hand. "We are ready to order champagne," she announced loudly, her voice echoing in the private room. "The most expensive bottle of champagne you have, please. We are celebrating tonight." The waiter hurried away and returned a few minutes later with a silver bucket filled with ice and a beautiful green bottle. He popped the cork with a loud, festive sound and poured the bubbling golden liquid into 4 tall crystal flutes. He placed the glasses on the mahogany table and discreetly backed out of the room. Robert picked up his flute and held it high in the air. The rest of the table followed suit. I picked up my glass, letting the cold crystal rest against my fingers. "To family," Robert declared, his voice booming with absolute triumph. "To putting the past behind us and securing our future. To family." Susan and Jessica echoed happily, clinking their glasses together. Todd looked directly at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute victory. "To finally doing the right thing, Chloe," he added, holding his glass out toward me. I raised my glass to meet his. The crystal made a sharp ringing sound as it struck the edge of his flute. I brought the rim of the glass to my lips and allowed myself to smile. It was not a weak, terrified smile. It was not the smile of a broken child begging for a Thanksgiving invitation. It was a cold, dark, calculating smile that did not quite reach my eyes. I took a small sip of the champagne. It tasted like absolute perfection. They sat around the table laughing and drinking and looking at the dinner menus. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully outsmarted the annoying little auditor and secured the money they desperately needed to save their fake, luxurious lives. They thought I was going to quietly step aside and let them dump Aunt Clara into a miserable state-run nursing ward to die alone. But I knew the truth. I knew that the power of attorney documents sitting in Todd's suit pocket was entirely legally worthless. I knew that Clara's house and her entire life savings were currently locked inside an impenetrable, irrevocable living trust protected by a ruthless former federal prosecutor. I knew that my hidden micro-recorder had just captured 30 minutes of highly illegal felony confessions. And most importantly, I knew that exactly 7 days from tonight, Todd's law firm was hosting their annual corporate gala at the downtown convention center. It was the most important event of their year. Every senior partner, every major client, and every superior court judge in the district would be in attendance wearing tuxedos and evening gowns. It was the absolute pinnacle of their social calendar. I sat quietly at the table listening to my mother brag about her upcoming country club events. I drank my champagne and let them enjoy their fake victory, because I knew that in exactly 7 days, I was going to walk into that massive corporate gala in front of everyone they respected, and I was going to burn their entire lives to the ground. The week following the dinner at the Pacific Grill felt like an eternity. Every morning I woke up before the sun, sitting in the quiet of my Seattle home with a cup of black coffee, listening to the audio file I had captured. Over and over, I heard Robert's arrogant voice proudly admitting to forging Clara's signature. I heard Todd, dripping with condescension, explaining exactly how he was bypassing federal banking regulations to funnel the stolen money into his firm's private escrow account. The raw, undeniable proof was securely locked away in Helen's office with heavily encrypted backups hidden in 3 separate locations. Clara was entirely safe. Her home and her savings were perfectly shielded behind the irrevocable living trust. I had built the fortress. Now I just had to wait for the exact right moment to open the gates and let the wolves destroy themselves. For Robert and Susan, there was no stage more important than the annual spring fundraising gala at their affluent community church in Portland. This was not a humble parish gathering with folding tables and potluck dinners. This was a massive high society event. It was the absolute epicenter of their social power, a place where the wealthiest parishioners mingled freely with city council members, local politicians, and superior court judges. For my parents, religion was simply another country club. The church was their favorite venue to pose as the moral, wealthy, and charitable pillars of the community. They used the congregation as a captive audience for their flawless family performance. Their entire existence was built on optics, and tonight was the most important performance of their year. I arrived at the luxury hotel ballroom downtown precisely at 7 o'clock. I did not have an invitation. I did not need one. The doors were wide open to anyone who looked like they belonged and carried a checkbook. I checked my wool coat at the front desk and paused to look at my reflection in the gilded lobby mirror. I had dressed meticulously for this ambush. I wore a tailored emerald green evening gown that was sharp, elegant, and completely devoid of the weak, frightened energy I had projected at the steakhouse. My hair was styled flawlessly. My posture was perfectly straight. I was wearing my armor. I took one deep, steadying breath and pushed through the heavy double doors into the grand ballroom. The venue was spectacular. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive golden glow over dozens of round tables, all draped in crisp white linen and adorned with towering floral centerpieces. Waiters in sharp black vests moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes and delicate appetizers. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing an elegant, cultured soundtrack to the low hum of wealthy people, congratulating themselves on their own generosity. I moved quietly along the perimeter of the room, keeping to the shadows, while my eyes scanned the glittering crowd. It did not take me long to find them. They had positioned themselves exactly where I knew they would be, claiming the most visible table right at the front of the main stage. Jessica was standing near the private bar, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. She wore a stunning silver sequined designer dress that easily cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She held a glass of champagne in one hand, resting her other hand prominently on her hip, to ensure everyone saw her sparkling heavy tennis bracelet. She looked radiant, wealthy, and completely carefree. Nobody in that ballroom had any idea that her country club membership was currently suspended for unpaid dues or that the luxury vehicle she drove was actively pending repossession. A few feet away, Todd was working the room with his signature aggressive charm. He stood in a small elite circle of older men wearing expensive custom tuxedos. I instantly recognized 2 of them from local news articles. One was a prominent commercial real estate developer, and the other was a sitting district court judge. Todd was smiling broadly, slapping the judge lightly on the shoulder, projecting the flawless image of a highly successful senior law partner who had the entire world exactly where he wanted it. He looked incredibly relieved. He looked like a man who believed his massive financial crimes had been successfully buried. He thought the forged reverse mortgage funds would be wiring directly into his private escrow account the very next morning. He thought he was completely safe from the internal embezzlement audit at his firm. And then there were Robert and Susan. My parents were deep in conversation with the senior pastor, smiling warmly and nodding with deep manufactured sincerity. Susan wore a heavy pearl necklace and a conservative but obviously expensive navy silk dress. Robert played the part of the distinguished patriarch flawlessly in a custom-fitted tuxedo. They were entirely in their element, soaking up the respect and admiration of the exact community they so desperately wanted to rule. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking directly toward their table. I kept my head held high and my expression completely unreadable. I did not rush my steps. I let my presence slowly register as I navigated through the tightly packed room. Susan was the first one to notice me. She was in the middle of a delicate, polite laugh when her eyes locked onto mine. Her mouth froze half open. The color instantly drained from her carefully powdered face. She reached out quickly and grabbed Robert tightly by the arm, her manicured fingernails digging sharply into his tuxedo jacket. Robert turned his head, clearly annoyed by the sudden interruption, but when he saw me walking toward them, his jaw physically dropped. They were completely paralyzed by shock. I was the absolute last person on earth they expected to see tonight. They thought I was sitting alone in my small Seattle house crying over Aunt Clara and feeling completely defeated by their legal threats. They thought they had successfully manipulated me into total surrender. They certainly did not expect their estranged, unwanted daughter to crash their most important social event of the year, dressed like she owned the entire building. I stopped right in front of them, offering a bright, terribly pleasant smile. "Good evening, Mother. Good evening, Dad. It is a truly beautiful gala tonight." Susan recovered her composure first, forcing a tight, incredibly strained smile onto her face. She glanced nervously at the pastor, who was still standing just a few feet away. "Chloe," she whispered through tightly clenched teeth, keeping her voice incredibly low so no one else could hear the venom. "What on earth are you doing here? You were absolutely not invited to this dinner." "You told me just last week that you wanted us to be a family again," I replied, keeping my voice cheerful and just loud enough for the people at the neighboring tables to catch fragments of our conversation. "You said you wanted to put the past behind us." I decided I did not want to wait for Thanksgiving. I wanted to come down and support you tonight, especially since you are making such a massive, generous donation to the church building fund. Robert leaned in close to me, his face flushing with sudden angry heat. "You need to leave right now," he hissed, his eyes darting frantically around the room to see if anyone important was watching us. "We are busy. We are speaking with important people. Go wait in the hotel lobby or drive back to Seattle. We will call you tomorrow when the bank wire clears." "I am not going anywhere, Robert," I said, dropping the cheerful act and letting my voice harden just enough for him to hear the sharp steel underneath. "I drove 3 hours to get here. I am going to stay and watch the entire show." Before Robert could formulate another quiet threat, the loud, sharp tapping of a microphone echoed through the grand ballroom. The string quartet stopped playing immediately. The senior pastor had walked up the short carpeted steps to the main stage and was standing behind the heavy wooden podium, adjusting the microphone stand. The crowd quieted down quickly, turning their attention to the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pastor announced, his voice echoing warmly through the large venue speakers. "Thank you all for joining us tonight. Your incredible generosity is what allows our beautiful community to thrive and grow. Tonight we are closing our Capitol Building Fund campaign, and I am deeply honored to invite one of our most dedicated and generous families to the stage. Please welcome a man who truly embodies the spirit of family values and selfless charity, Mr. Robert Myers." The ballroom erupted in enthusiastic, polite applause. Susan quickly smoothed the lapels of Robert's tuxedo jacket and gave him a sharp pushing motion toward the stage. Robert forced a brilliant, humble smile onto his face. He completely ignored me, stepping widely around my space as if I were a piece of dirty furniture, and walked proudly up the stairs to the stage. He shook the pastor's hand warmly for the hired photographers. A young church volunteer walked onto the stage carrying a massive, oversized novelty check. Robert took the cardboard prop and held it up for the entire ballroom to see. The amount written in thick black marker was $50,000. The crowd clapped even louder. Robert stepped up to the microphone, gripping the edges of the wooden podium. He looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, politicians, and judges. He looked exactly like a man who had finally achieved everything he ever wanted. "Thank you, Pastor Robert," began, his voice echoing with perfectly practiced humility. "My wife Susan and I have always believed that true wealth is not measured by what you have, but by what you freely give back to your community. This church has been our spiritual home for 2 decades. It is where we proudly raised our daughters. It is where we learned the true meaning of sacrifice and the importance of taking care of one's own flock. I stood near the front table listening to his words and felt a deep physical wave of nausea wash over me. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy was staggering. He was standing on a stage preaching about sacrifice and family values while actively planning to use a forged reverse mortgage to dump his own dying sister into a neglected state facility. He was writing a $50,000 vanity check to a church building fund using the exact money he was stealing from Aunt Clara's life savings. He assumed the massive bank transfer was safely processing through the automated system tonight. He believed Clara's stolen equity would be sitting in his account tomorrow morning, ready to cover this massive fraudulent donation. "We live in a world where family bonds are easily broken," Robert continued, shaking his head with a look of profound manufactured sorrow. "But Susan and I have always fiercely protected our family. When a member of our family falls ill or faces a terrible crisis, we do not turn our backs. We step up. We do the hard work. That is the fundamental duty of love. And it is in that exact spirit of duty and love that we proudly present this donation to the church building fund tonight." The crowd began to applaud again. Several people stood up from their chairs, clapping loudly. Susan was beaming from her seat at the front table, wiping an imaginary tear from the corner of her eye. Jessica was clapping and smiling at the people around her, making sure they knew she was directly connected to the generous, wealthy man on stage. Todd was standing near the judge, nodding in respectful approval. The applause began to fade into a gentle murmur. Robert handed the giant check back to the pastor and prepared to step away from the microphone. He thought his grand performance was perfectly executed. That was my cue. Before the pastor could take the microphone back, I stepped forward out of the crowd and walked briskly up the short stairs to the stage. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that nobody tried to stop me. Robert saw me approaching out of the corner of his eye and froze completely. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of absolute sheer panic. He took a tiny step backward as I walked right past him and grabbed the microphone firmly with both hands. I looked out over the massive ballroom. Hundreds of curious faces were staring back at me. The silence in the room was sudden and absolute. I could see the judges, the politicians, and the wealthy parishioners looking confused by the unscripted addition to the program. I looked down at the front table. Susan was gripping the edge of her seat, her knuckles completely white. Jessica looked like she had stopped breathing. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully through the large speakers. "My name is Chloe Myers. I am Robert and Susan's daughter." A gentle, appreciative murmur rippled through the crowd. They loved a touching family moment. They thought this was a planned, emotional tribute. Robert stood awkwardly a few feet behind me, trapped on the stage, unable to physically remove me without causing a massive public scandal. "I know I'm not on the official schedule tonight," I continued, flashing a warm, bright smile at the audience. "But after hearing my father speak so beautifully about family values and the sacred duty of taking care of one's own, I simply could not sit in the audience and stay quiet. I felt compelled to come up here and publicly thank my parents for their incredible, unparalleled dedication to our family." I paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. I glanced down at the front table. Susan slowly let out a long, shaky breath. The rigid panic in her shoulders began to drop. She actually smiled back at me. Robert let out a tiny, completely silent sigh of relief behind me. They honestly believed my act. They thought my desperate need for their approval had won out over my anger. They thought I had come up to the stage to publicly validate their grand performance and beg for a permanent place in their shiny, perfect world. Specifically, I continued turning my attention back to the crowd. I want to thank them for their extraordinary recent efforts regarding my Aunt Clara. As many of you know, Clara recently suffered a severe, catastrophic medical emergency. It has been an incredibly dark and difficult time for our family. But my parents and my brother-in-law, Todd Harrison, have worked tirelessly behind the scenes this past week. They have gone to absolute extraordinary lengths, taking extreme legal and financial measures to ensure that Clara's entire estate was handled exactly the way they saw fit. The audience nodded along in sympathetic agreement. A few older women near the front clapped politely at the mention of family loyalty during a medical crisis. Susan and Robert were officially basking in the glow. Their public image was being cemented and elevated by the very daughter they had thrown away. They looked incredibly smug. They thought they had won the ultimate victory. But while my parents were smiling proudly, basking in the validation, I shifted my gaze slightly toward the side of the room. Todd Harrison was standing near the judge, clutching his drink. He was not smiling. Unlike my parents, Todd was a professional courtroom lawyer. He spent his life reading people, reading rooms, and looking for hidden traps. He knew that people like me did not just magically surrender and join the family cheering section. He was watching my face with intense paranoid scrutiny. And then Todd saw exactly what I wanted him to see. While the crowd was looking at me and my parents were smiling for the cameras, Todd watched my right hand drop to my side. He watched me lift my fingers and make a very deliberate, sharp hand signal toward the back corner of the grand ballroom. Todd's eyes instantly snapped toward the back of the room following my gesture. Standing directly next to the main audio-visual control board was a man he did not recognize, holding a laptop connected directly to the venue's massive projection screens. The man gave me a thumbs up. I looked back at Todd. The color vanished from his face so fast, he looked physically ill. The smug, confident lawyer completely evaporated. In that split second of silent communication, Todd realized with absolute horrifying certainty that the power of attorney document in his pocket was completely worthless. He realized the money was never coming. He realized he was standing in a room full of judges and politicians, and the trap had already sprung shut around his neck. I smiled brightly at the audience, allowing the gentle applause to wash over the stage. My parents were still standing just a few feet behind me, practically glowing with unearned pride. They honestly believed I was standing at the podium to deliver a heartfelt tribute to their incredible generosity. They thought I was finally surrendering to their manipulation and begging for their approval in front of their wealthy peers. I kept my expression perfectly pleasant as I looked out into the crowd, but my eyes were locked directly on Todd Harrison. The charismatic lawyer was standing near the private bar, clutching a crystal glass of expensive scotch. He was the only person in the massive ballroom who realized something was terribly wrong. I held his gaze for a long moment, and then I gave a sharp, deliberate nod to the audio-visual technician standing in the shadows at the back of the room. The heavy mechanical whirring sound echoed softly above us. The congregation fell completely silent as the massive projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling directly behind the altar. My mother let out a soft, delighted gasp. She assumed the church had prepared a surprise slideshow of our family photographs to accompany my speech. She quickly adjusted her heavy pearl necklace and prepared to look appropriately moved. A bright, blinding white light suddenly washed over the stage as the commercial projector hummed to life. But the image that appeared on the massive screen was not a beautiful photograph from a family vacation. It was a high-definition scan of a very dense, very complex legal banking document. I turned back to the microphone, my voice ringing crystal clear through the cavernous church hall. My parents have worked absolutely tirelessly this past week to secure a massive financial windfall, I announced to the confused crowd. And I believe every single person in this room deserves to see exactly how they managed to do it. The screen displayed the first page of the reverse mortgage application for Aunt Clara's house. I had meticulously edited the digital file before giving it to the technician. The top of the document clearly showed Clara's home address and the massive requested loan amount. But the most damning evidence was on the second slide. The screen transitioned to show the final authorization page. The forged signature was magnified and circled in bright, thick red ink. Directly next to it on the right side of the screen, I had placed a scanned copy of Clara's actual authentic signature from an old birthday card. The visual difference was absolutely jarring and undeniable. The elegant, flowing cursive of Clara's real handwriting stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the jagged, cramped tracing that Robert had fraudulently forced onto the banking contract. A low collective murmur of confusion began to ripple through the velvet-lined pews. Wealthy parishioners squinted at the giant screen trying to comprehend what they were looking at. Susan turned around to look at the projection, and the confident, gracious smile instantly melted off her face. She let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Robert stumbled backward, his custom-fitted tuxedo suddenly looking entirely too large for his shrinking frame. All the blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. But I was not finished. The presentation shifted to the next slide. I wanted to ensure everyone understood the real motivation behind this incredible act of family sacrifice. I continued, my voice echoing with cold precision. The screen flashed to a stark, undeniable display of Todd and Jessica's true financial reality. The images were massive and impossible to ignore. The crowd stared in absolute shock at the severe delinquency notices from 3 separate maxed-out mortgages on their luxury estate. Bright red foreclosure warnings dominated the center of the screen. Next to the mortgages were the official repossession notices for both of their high-end sport utility vehicles. And right beside that was the embarrassing civil judgment from their exclusive country club, officially suspending their membership for thousands of dollars in unpaid dues. Jessica let out a loud, piercing shriek from her seat at the front table. She covered her face with her hands, her silver sequined designer dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The illusion of her flawless, wealthy American dream was being violently ripped apart in front of the exact people she spent her entire life trying to impress. The murmurs in the crowd grew significantly louder, quickly turning into shocked whispers and outraged gasps. But the absolute final blow was waiting on the next slide. The screen transitioned one last time, displaying an official internal memorandum printed on the thick embossed letterhead of Todd Harrison's own prestigious law firm. The subject line was highlighted in yellow. It announced an immediate emergency internal investigation into missing client escrow funds. The sitting district court judge who had been laughing and drinking with Todd just 10 minutes ago stood up abruptly from his chair. His face was a mask of absolute revulsion and horror. Every lawyer and politician in that room knew exactly what an emergency escrow audit meant. They knew they were looking at undeniable documented proof of massive corporate embezzlement and severe felony misconduct. Todd was completely paralyzed in the center of the ballroom. His dark eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The expensive crystal Scotch glass slipped right through his numb fingers and shattered violently against the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the tense, heavy silence of the church. I did not give them a single second to recover their breath. I pulled my cell phone from the hidden pocket of my emerald evening gown. I had already queued up the audio file from the micro recorder. I plugged the auxiliary cord from the podium directly into my phone, bypassing the microphone entirely. I looked at Robert and Susan, who were trembling uncontrollably on the stage beside me, and I pressed play. The crisp, clear, high-definition audio from the steakhouse dinner blasted through the church's expensive surround sound system. The acoustics of the vaulted ceiling amplified every single word, making the confession sound completely unavoidable. Robert's arrogant, condescending voice filled the massive room. Everyone heard him clearly say that Clara was too sick and confused to understand complex banking documents. They heard him scoff and roll his eyes through the speakers. They heard the biological brother explicitly admit that he signed the application for her because she would never wake up and need the house anyway. They heard my own mother chiming in smoothly, supporting the theft, and ordering an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate. The wealthy congregation gasped in absolute visceral horror. The people who had just applauded Robert for his deep moral values were now listening to him openly confess to severe elder abuse and federal bank fraud on a crystal-clear recording. Then Todd's smooth, manipulative voice echoed off the church walls. The crowd listened in stunned, breathless silence as the respected corporate attorney bragged about his fraternity brother at the title company. They heard him explicitly detail his criminal plan to fast-track the fraudulent appraisal and bypass all standard federal banking checks. And then they heard the most damning sentence of all. They heard Todd proudly admit that he was diverting the stolen home equity funds directly into his law firm's private offshore account just so his firm could breathe and he could hide his massive embezzlement tracks. The audio file ended with the sharp ringing sound of our crystal champagne flutes clinking together in a toast. The fallout in the ballroom was immediate and utterly catastrophic. The entire flawless facade my parents had spent 2 decades meticulously building shattered completely and irreparably into dust. The senior pastor who had just shaken Robert's hand and praised his selfless charity physically backed away from my father. The pastor raised his hands in shock and disgust, his face pale with deep horror. He looked down at the giant $50,000 novelty check resting near the podium, realizing it was completely worthless and funded by stolen money. The wealthy parishioners began shouting and pointing at the stage. The elegant, respectable fundraising gala instantly dissolved into absolute chaotic outrage. Susan completely lost her mind. The perfectly poised, graceful socialite completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, cornered animal lashing out in pure desperation. She lunged forward across the stage, her manicured hands clawing violently toward the audio equipment. She tried to rip the auxiliary cord out of my phone, but I smoothly stepped backward out of her reach. "It is a lie!" Susan screamed hysterically, her voice cracking and echoing horribly through the room. She pointed a shaking finger at me, tears of absolute panic streaming down her face. "She is a crazy, ungrateful child. She is just jealous of us. She used computers to fake those voices. It is all fake. Do not listen to her." But absolutely nobody believed her. The documentation displayed on the giant screen was far too detailed and legally precise. The voices on the audio recording were undeniably authentic. The specific complex legal jargon Todd had used on the tape could not possibly be faked by an outsider. The entire congregation knew they were looking at the raw, ugly truth. I looked down from the stage and locked eyes with Todd. The charismatic, fearless apex predator was entirely gone. He looked exactly like a hunted rat trapped in a maze. He knew the internal audit memo on the screen was completely real, and he knew the audio recording was a fatal, inescapable blow to his career and his freedom. The walls were closing in, and he completely panicked. Todd turned around and sprinted frantically toward the side exit of the grand ballroom. He shoved violently past the wealthy donors he had just been charming. He knocked a silver tray of champagne glasses entirely out of a waiter's hands, sending shattered crystal and expensive wine flying everywhere across the white linen tablecloths. He did not care about optics anymore. He just wanted to escape into the dark, rainy night before the consequences arrived. But he did not make it to the door. Before Todd could even reach the heavy brass handles, the main oak doors of the ballroom burst open violently from the outside. The shouting and the chaos in the room instantly fell into a stunned, breathless silence as a dozen uniformed police officers and armed federal agents swarmed aggressively into the elegant space. Helen had not waited for the gala. 2 days ago, she had taken the digital files, the encrypted emails, the property records, and the audio recordings directly to her most trusted contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local prosecutor's office. She had laid out a complete, airtight, comprehensive case of federal wire fraud, identity theft, severe elder exploitation, and corporate embezzlement. She had handed them the perfect wrapped gift, and they had moved with terrifying, aggressive speed. 2 federal agents in dark tactical jackets intercepted Todd just feet away from the exit. Todd tried to shove past them, his face twisted in desperate panic, but they moved with practiced efficiency. They tackled the wealthy lawyer hard against the polished hardwood floor. The loud, sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed clearly over the stunned murmur of the crowd. They dragged Todd roughly to his feet. His expensive custom-tailored suit was wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. His hair was completely disheveled. He was entirely humiliated, arrested, and placed in chains right in front of the local politicians and the Superior Court judges he used to golf with on the weekends. The judges literally turned their backs on him, looking away in absolute pure disgust. Todd kept his head down, refusing to meet anyone's eyes as the agents marched him forcefully out the door. Jessica let out another horrible, piercing scream. She ran toward her husband, her expensive high heels slipping slightly on the spilled wine, but a uniformed police officer stepped firmly into her path, holding his hand up to block her. She collapsed heavily into an empty chair, burying her face in her arms and sobbing uncontrollably. The brutal reality finally hit her. The money was completely gone. The luxury cars were gone. Her perfect, wealthy country club life was permanently over, and she was about to become the disgraced, broke wife of a convicted federal felon. Back on the main stage, 2 local police officers walked methodically up the carpeted steps and approached my father. Robert was still standing near the wooden podium, completely frozen in a state of catatonic shock. He looked incredibly small, pathetic, and entirely defeated. He did not look like a proud patriarch anymore. He looked like an old, broken thief. Robert Myers, the lead officer, said, his voice booming with deep, uncompromising authority over the quiet room. "You are under arrest for identity theft, forgery, and felony elder financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The officer spun Robert around firmly and pulled his arms behind his back. The heavy metal handcuffs snapped shut tightly around his wrists. My father did not fight back. He did not try to argue. He did not say a single word in his own defense. He just stared blankly at the floor, accepting his total destruction as they continued reading him his Miranda rights in front of the entire horrified congregation. The man who had just presented a fake $50,000 donation check pretending to be the moral pillar of the community was now being paraded out of his own church in chains. Susan fell heavily to her knees on the stage, weeping loudly and uncontrollably. She reached her shaking hands out for Robert, but the officers completely ignored her, carefully leading him down the stairs and out of the ballroom. Her perfectly styled hair was a ruined mess. Her heavy pearl necklace hung crookedly against her silk dress. She was left entirely alone on the floor of the stage, surrounded by the loud, condemning whispers and the judging, disgusted stares of the high society friends she had worshipped for 20 long years. They were already whispering about her. They were whispering about how she had thrown her own daughter out onto the street like garbage, and how she had actively tried to rob her own dying sister-in-law for a new car. She would never be welcome in this church or this affluent community ever again. Her social life was completely, permanently annihilated. I stood near the edge of the wooden stage, watching the police lead Todd and Robert out into the cold, dark Seattle rain. The giant projection screen was still shining brightly behind me, displaying the undeniable, absolute truth for everyone in the room to see. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. The heavy, suffocating burden I had carried since I was 18 years old finally lifted completely off my shoulders. I was no longer the frightened, unwanted child, hiding in the shadows, begging for scraps of their approval. I was the woman who had meticulously burned their corrupt fake empire to the ground and fiercely protected the only family that actually mattered. The days following the church gala were a whirlwind of legal action and public disgrace. When the house of cards finally collapsed, it did not just fall. It violently disintegrated. Todd Harrison, the arrogant corporate lawyer who thought he could outsmart the federal banking system, and a 28-year-old financial auditor found out exactly how the real world operates when you strip away the country club privilege. The internal investigation at his law firm, combined with the massive, unredacted file of evidence Helen handed over to the FBI, left him with absolutely no room to negotiate. The federal prosecutors did not care about his golf buddies or his tailored Italian suits. They cared about the fact that he was actively stealing money from innocent clients to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was immediately disbarred and permanently stripped of his license to practice law in any state. The legal community he had proudly boasted about completely turned its back on him. 6 months later, a federal judge handed down his sentence. He received 5 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and attempted elder abuse. He did not get to serve his time in a comfortable, low-security, white-collar facility either. He was placed in a strict federal prison where his status meant absolutely nothing. He went from drinking expensive scotch in private dining rooms to eating standardized meals on a metal tray. Jessica fell right along with him, and her descent was just as spectacular. Without Todd's stolen money to prop up her fake luxury lifestyle, the creditors descended on her like a pack of starving wolves. the bank repossessed her gleaming silver sport utility vehicle right out of her pristine driveway in broad daylight while her neighbors watched from their porches. 3 weeks later, the bank officially foreclosed on their massive 5-bedroom estate. Jessica was completely stripped of her socialite royalty. The wealthy friends she had spent years cultivating suddenly stopped returning her phone calls. The exclusive country club officially banned her from the premises and publicly posted her delinquent dues. The last time I heard anything about my older sister, she was wearing a polyester uniform and working the cash register at a local fast food chain, just trying to make rent on a tiny 1-bedroom apartment. The girl who used to sip expensive champagne and brutally mock my modest lifestyle was now asking people if they wanted fries with their order. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. She had built her entire life on a foundation of cruel lies, toxic debt, and stolen money. When you build a house on quicksand, you cannot act surprised when the ground finally swallows you whole. As for my parents, Robert and Susan, their ultimate ruin was perhaps the most poetic justice of all. They managed to avoid a federal prison sentence, but only by the absolute narrowest of margins. Helen and the federal prosecutors offered them a brutal ironclad plea deal. They avoided jail time, but they were forced to publicly plead guilty to identity theft and felony elder financial fraud. The legal restitution and the massive court fines completely bankrupted them. The state forced them to sell their beautiful, pristine house in the suburbs to pay back the severe penalties. They lost everything they had spent 2 decades hoarding. But losing their money was not the worst part for Robert and Susan. The worst part was losing their audience. The social fallout from the church gala was absolute and permanent. The affluent congregation they had worshipped and manipulated for years completely shunned them. The senior pastor publicly denounced their actions from the pulpit. Their neighbors crossed the street when they saw them walking. They became total social pariahs in the city of Portland. Destitute and entirely isolated, they were forced to pack whatever modest belongings they had left and move into a rundown trailer park 2 hours outside the city limits. The woman who had thrown her own daughter out onto the street like yesterday's garbage was now living in a rusted tin box with a leaking roof. The man who had proudly forged his dying sister's signature to steal her home was now checking the couch cushions for spare change to buy groceries. They never reached out to apologize. They never tried to make amends. Narcissists never truly change. They just sit in their misery blaming the rest of the world for the harsh consequences of their own deliberate actions. They got exactly the life they deserved. While my biological family was facing the brutal reality of their choices, my real family was experiencing an absolute miracle. Against all medical odds and the grim predictions of the specialists, Aunt Clara woke up. The doctors called it a miraculous recovery. Within a few short weeks, she was off the feeding tube and breathing entirely on her own. Within a month, she was speaking clearly and walking the hospital corridors with the help of a dedicated physical therapist. Because Helen had legally locked all of Clara's assets inside the irrevocable living trust, Clara did not have to worry about a single medical bill. Her home was perfectly safe. Her life savings were completely secure. She was able to focus entirely on healing, surrounded by the absolute best private nurses and rehabilitation specialists in the state of Washington. I was right there beside her every single step of the way. When the auditing firm I worked for caught wind of what I had done, they did not reprimand me. In fact, the senior partners were so incredibly impressed by my meticulous private investigation and my ability to quietly dismantle a complex financial fraud ring that they called me into the boardroom. They gave me a massive promotion. At 28 years old, I became the youngest junior partner in the history of the financial firm. The promotion came with a substantial salary increase and a very generous signing bonus. I did not buy designer clothes or a luxury vehicle with the money. I used my bonus to buy something much more valuable. I purchased a beautiful, quiet lakefront home just outside of Seattle. The house has a large wraparound porch, a massive green garden for Clara to plant her spring tomatoes, and huge glass windows that let in the warm morning light. I moved Clara out of her old house and into the new property with me. We live there together in absolute peace and comfort. We drink tea on the porch in the mornings, and we watch the water ripple against the wooden dock. There is no screaming, no manipulation, and no fear. Sometimes in the quiet hours of the evening, I sit on our back porch and look out at the dark water. I think about that cold, rainy night 10 years ago. I think about the terrified teenager sitting on black garbage bags in the pouring rain, waiting for someone to save her. For so many years, I thought that was the night I lost my family. I thought it was the absolute worst night of my life. But looking back now with the clarity of time and distance, I realize it was the exact opposite. That was the night I was truly set free. I did not lose a family. I lost my abusers. I lost the toxic people who would have spent my entire life dragging me down to serve their own selfish, endless needs. Blood does not make a family. True family is built on respect, honesty, and unconditional protection. It is built by the people who show up for you when you are completely broken and who stand beside you when you finally decide to fight back. Clara showed up for me when I had absolutely nothing. She gave me a safe place to sleep, and she taught me how to believe in my own worth. I showed up for her when the wolves came to her door. We protected each other, and now we have a beautiful, peaceful life that Robert, Susan, and Jessica could never even comprehend. We survived the storm and we built a fortress they can never touch. If you are watching this and you are carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of a toxic family, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your abusers your loyalty just because you share the same DNA. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into a space they designed to keep you small and quiet. Setting boundaries is not cruel. Protecting yourself is not a betrayal. It is the most vital, basic form of survival. You have the absolute right to walk away from people who hurt you, and you have the right to build a life full of peace, success, and genuine love. Thank you so much for staying with me through this incredible journey. If my story resonated with you or gave you the courage to stand up for your own boundaries, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. I would love to connect with you in the comments. Let me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. Remember that your true worth is not defined by the people who failed to love you properly. You are entirely enough. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story. If there is one profound thing this entire nightmare has taught me, it is that the word family is far too often used as a weapon by the very people who should be protecting you. We are raised from childhood to believe that biological ties are absolutely sacred and that we must endlessly forgive every betrayal simply because we share the same last name or the same bloodline. But I am here to tell you that is a dangerous lie designed to keep victims completely silent and compliant. Family isn't defined by the people who share your blood but are willing to sell you out for their own selfish greed. Family is the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but yourself. Aunt Clara was my true family because she gave me a safe harbor when my own parents literally tossed me out into the cold rain. And when the time came, I had to become her fierce protector when the wolves circled her hospital bed. I learned the hardest way possible, that you must never compromise your boundaries for people who only use the word family to manipulate and control you. They will drain you of your financial resources, your emotional energy, and your hard-earned peace of mind if you leave the door even slightly cracked open. Do not let them. You owe it to yourself to guard your life and the lives of the vulnerable people you truly love with absolutely everything you have. Sometimes the most loving and courageous thing you can do for yourself is to turn the lock and refuse to let those toxic people back into your life. It is not an act of cruelty or revenge. It is an act of survival and profound self-respect. I know that many of you watching this right now might be nodding your heads because you have lived through something incredibly similar in your own lives. Toxic family dynamics. Elder abuse and blind financial greed can deeply wound even the strongest, most resilient people. If you have ever had to set hard boundaries with toxic relatives, or if you have ever had to protect someone you love from the exact people who were supposed to care for them, I truly want to hear your story. You are absolutely not alone in this fight, and sharing our shared experiences makes us all so much stronger. Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one of your messages, and they mean the absolute world to me. Before you go, please let me know what state or country you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I always find it so fascinating to see how far these stories travel and to connect with all of you across so many different time zones. Do not forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story about justice being served. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.